Chapter 168. But now, reality told her that she was wrong, because she had never considered anyone else. She thought that in this life, she would be the only one to walk down this path. But she did not expect that there was someone who was trying so hard to walk down this path with her. That person wanted to capture her, protect her, and be entangled with her life. So, unknowingly, she had also become entangled. Had she inadvertently caused a disaster to befall her? Why was this happening? Gong Yimo could not figure it out. She did not want to love anyone, she did not want that. She had had enough of the pain of giving up everything for her lover. She had had enough of the pain of having someone in her heart and yearning for him day and night. She had had enough of worrying about gains and losses, and even more so, the pain of being sent to hell after being betrayed. How happy was it to be alone? Even if she turned the world upside down, in the end, it was just a life. She did not need to bear any burden of feelings. Even if she died, she would still be free and easy. So please do not pester her. She was fine being alone. The sound of flowing water entered Gong Yimo's ears. This was probably the tributary of the soaring Dragon River in the capital. The water was neither wide nor narrow. She crossed the bridge and then broke it with a backhand. The moment the bridge broke and fell into the water, she felt a surge of joy in her heart. So be it. She would not be involved in all the disputes in the capital. Just as she turned around, a voice came from afar. It was filled with fear and called out to her. Royal sister. Gong Dai did not know why he had to call out to her from so far away. But when he saw her turn around, her clothes fluttering in the wind as if she was free and at ease, he panicked. If he did not call out to her, he would not have a chance. Seeing that it was Gong Dai, Gong Yimo felt afraid. After recognizing his feelings, those turbulent feelings were like a scourge to her. He was here to tie her up. He was someone who wanted to invade her life and everything about her. As she thought of this, a sword suddenly appeared in her hand and she placed it on her neck. Don't come over. Her eyes were cold as she looked at Gong Dai as if she was looking at an enemy who wanted to bring her to eternal damnation. The blade of the sword was emitting a cold light, as if he took another step forward, she would cut her own throat in front of him. Under the moonlight, her expression was one that Gong Dai had never seen before. Therefore, he subconsciously stopped and stood on the other side of the river. The two of them faced each other, separated by a river. He was panting slightly. After running for so long, his lungs were hurting, but he still looked at her without blinking, afraid that she would leave his sight. Royal sister, don't go. Gong Yimo looked at him coldly, but her tone softened. Gong Dai, you can't protect me. Now, as long as I turn back, what awaits me is not those people snatching it away, but the Emperor's pursuit. After all, there was such a big commotion tonight. If he still couldn't find out that she was still alive, the Emperor wouldn't be the Emperor anymore. He won't. Gong Dai shouted anxiously. Imperial father likes you so much, he won't be willing to do it. Gong Yimo smiled. Gong Dai. I know him much better than you. In the face of ambition, that little bit of affection is nothing. Go back, there's no place for me in the capital anymore. Even if it's for me. Gong Dai suddenly roared. He gasped for breath, his heart and lungs torn. He felt that his entire chest was stuffy and painful. It was as if his heart was pierced by a sword, and the pain spread to his limbs and bones. It was as painful as being torn apart by 5 horses. But even so, he was still unwilling to let go, unwilling to let go. If they want to catch you, I'll protect you. If they want to kill you, I'll protect you. The Emperor doesn't love you, I love you. He took a few steps forward and walked to the riverside, looking at her pleadingly. Just for me, can you stay? Gong Yimo bit her lower lip lightly, showing some pity. It's impossible between us, you should give up. Why is it impossible? Gong Dai was unwilling to give up. Veins appeared on his forehead, like a trapped beast that had been forced to the extreme. Is it really because of the secular world? Gong Yimo closed her eyes, and her voice became colder. It's impossible for me to have such thoughts about my little brother who I spend all my time with, because you're the most important person to me, my family. I don't want to be your family. Gong Dai's voice was torn and became hoarse. He stepped into the water and walked toward Gong Yimo. I don't want to be your family, and I don't want to be your little brother. Gong Yimo's hand exerted force, and a trace of blood flowed from her neck, piercing Gong Dai's eyes red. Don't come over. Gong Dai seemed to be fixed in the water, and he really did not dare to take another step forward. The rapid current hit his waist coldly, and his black hair moved without wind. His expression was crazy, and his whole body was filled with sorrow. He looked at Gong Yimo in a daze, and there seemed to be tears in his eyes. Gong Yimo looked at him and closed her eyes. Go back. You're the person closest to me, and I'll come back in the future. But you and I are brother and sister, and will be brother and sister even in death. Don't struggle. It was as if he had been sentenced to death. He was forced to the end. Gong Dai looked at Gong Yimo deeply, and a dagger appeared in his hand. His voice was low and resolute. Brother and sister in life. No. If this is fate, I'll go against it and change it. After saying that, he suddenly cut the artery on his left hand. In an instant, blood gushed out like a fountain and fell into the river, forming an endless stream of black ribbons. Gong Dai. Gong Yimo's eyes widened, and she quickly put down her sword. She took a few steps forward, but she was stopped by Gong Dai's crazy eyes. Don't come over. I'll go over. He raised his bleeding left hand and walked towards Gong Yimo step by step in the water. The closer he got, the more his heart seemed to be strangely soothed. He did not feel any pain from the stab. Instead, he smiled, and his smile was relaxed and bright. If you care about ethics, I'll let the blood in half of my body dry, and cut off all ties with you, okay? Every word of this sentence was like knocking on Gong Yimo's eardrum. She was stunned on the spot, and she could not speak for a long time. The cold water made him pale and numb, and the smell of blood and the water vapor rolled over. Under the moonlight, his eyes gradually became clear and moving, as if there was light floating in them. I, Gong Dai, hereby swear. From today onwards, I'll cut off all ties with Gong Yimo, and will no longer be brother and sister. Gong Yimo could not help but cry. She squatted by the river and cried softly. Don't do this to me. I can't repay you. She did not know how to deal with his deep feelings, and how to repay him. She felt as if she was forced into a corner by him, but because he held up the sign of his feelings, she was powerless to resist. At this moment, Gong Dai had already walked across the river. He stood in the water, and was at the same height as Gong Yimo. Under the moonlight, his expression was unbelievably gentle, as if he was the messenger of salvation, gently wiping away her tears. I love you, and you don't have to repay me. Gong Yimo could not hold it in anymore, and her tears burst out. Because it was too cold, Gong Dai's wound on his left hand gradually coagulated, and it stopped bleeding. Gong Yimo suddenly took out something and put it in her mouth, and then kissed his wrist. Miraculously, with her kiss, the wound did not hurt at all. Gong Dai did not know if it was a psychological effect, or because she had just drunk something. When he looked up, Gong Yimo sucked on his lips. Chapter 169. Her initiative was something that he had only seen in his dreams. He subconsciously entangled his lips and teeth with hers, eagerly biting her. Gong Yimo passed him some strange liquid, which he unconsciously swallowed. The water is very cold, right? After Gong Yimo let go of him, Gong Dai was still panting slightly. His eyes were watery, and he looked very attractive. Why aren't you coming up? Gong Ju finally regained his senses and climbed ashore. Gong Yimo had already taken out a needle and thread, and she actually stitched up his wound needle by needle. The expected pain did not come. It was as if the needle under her hand did not pierce into his own hand. Gong Dai was shocked. He found that his body was soft and his consciousness was gradually blurring. It was extremely difficult for him to even open his mouth to speak. What did you give me to eat? He wanted to shake his head, but he could only sway slightly. He clearly still had a bit of consciousness, but his body was already drunk. This oral anesthetic was indeed very effective. Gong Yimo quickly stitched up his wound and applied ointment. When she was bandaging it, she said lightly to the other side of the river, How long do you want to watch the show? It turned out that a group of people had been hiding nearby. If Gong Yimo guessed correctly, they were chasing after Gong Dai. A masked man walked out. Even though his entire body was covered, Gong Yimo still recognized him at a glance. "I was wondering who was so sneaky." "So it's you. Then it's easy to explain. If you have a mother who likes to play tricks, naturally you have a son who likes to play sneak attacks." This person was the son of imperial concubine Long, Gong Shi. He was also the fourth prince of Dai Yu state. He listened to Gong Yimo's mockery and ridicule, but he was not angry. It's better to be sneaky than some people who violate the rules of the world, right? Gong Yimo picked up Gong Dai and sneered. "It's a bit difficult for you people to keep me here. What about us?" A bearded man appeared with a group of people. Gong Shu, in order to encircle her, actually did not hesitate to cooperate with Lu Yi's people. "Fourth Prince, do you know that colluding with outsiders is a capital offense?" Gong Shu smiled darkly. "But, he's already dead. Who would know?" Unexpectedly, his words did not scare Gong Yimo at all. Instead, she laughed out loud. "You're just a mob. You want to capture me? Give it a try." As she spoke, she ran along the river while holding Gong Ju tightly in her arms. At this moment, Gong Dai's body was only numb and his consciousness had been invaded. However, he held on with all his might and did not fall asleep. When he heard that someone had followed him to find the royal sister, he was furious. However, he couldn't move or open his mouth. He could only use his inner energy to wash his limbs over and over again. Little did he know that he had lost too much blood and the anesthetic had numbed his nerves. The more he did this, the more dizzy he felt. If this continued, he would lose consciousness. "No, wake up. The royal sister is in danger." The pursuers crossed the lake and surrounded them from all directions. Gong Yimo, with a sword in her hand, dyed the river red with blood, but she did not even look at it. However, there were too many pursuers. Her speed was involuntarily slowed down. From time to time, warm liquid would sprinkle on Gong Dai's body. However, it would quickly cool down, all the way to his heart. This blood, was it someone else's, or Gong Yimo's? He did not dare to think about it and did not dare to use his inner energy. Because of the blood loss, using inner energy would only accelerate the exhaustion of his body. He could not lose consciousness. "Wake up. The royal sister is in danger." "Not good. She wants to enter the city." Gong Shu's expression finally changed. Once they entered the city, the dragons would gather and Gong Yimo would not necessarily be theirs. When the bearded man heard this, he stretched out his hand. Immediately, someone passed a golden bow to him. He drew the bow and shot an arrow. In one breath, the target was the rapidly running figure. "No matter how fast you are, can you be faster than an arrow?" Gong Yimo had just cut down a person when an arrow pierced through the air towards her face. She narrowly avoided it. The wind from the arrow left a bloody mark on her face. She did not seem to notice it and continued to run forward. Failing her attack and being forced into a dead end, Gong Yimo seemed to have started to go crazy. A murderous aura that made people tremble erupted from her body. The murderous aura came from afar. It actually made the bearded man, who had drawn his bow again, slightly stunned. His gaze turned serious. He was Lu Yi's great general. He was brave and good at fighting. Countless lives had been lost under his hand. However, Gong Yimo's murderous aura was impossible to have unless she had killed tens of thousands of people. However, tens of thousands of people could be piled up into a mountain. The other party was a princess who was said to have been raised in the palace since she was young. How could she have such an aura? He was still fine. The pursuers who were close to her were even more directly faced with this aura. Their legs trembled and they almost knelt down. The air seemed to have turned heavy. Their hands that were slashing towards Gong Yimo became hesitant. It was as if she was a god, a tall mountain, an existence that could not be looked at directly. They were ants. Everything that obstructed her actions were courting death. Under this momentum, Gong Yimo's momentum was like a hot knife through butter. She slaughtered almost all of the pursuers and suddenly rushed out. However, the moment she broke out of the encirclement, an arrow suddenly shot towards her. She only had time to twist her body slightly. The arrow that had pierced her heart ruthlessly pierced her shoulder. Gong Yimo turned around and looked at the bearded man, who was still in the posture of drawing his bow. At this moment, he had already drawn another arrow and aimed it coldly at her. Gong Yimo smiled. It was clearly night and far away. Nothing could be seen clearly. However, the bearded man's eyesight was astonishing. Gong Yimo's eyes seemed to contain a mountain of knives and a sea of flames. It was also like the flames of hell. When he looked at her, he felt a sharp pain in his heart. His long-distance vision seemed to have suddenly disappeared in order to protect himself. He no longer dared to look at the other party's eyes. However, he saw the other party smile strangely at him. Then, she stretched out her hand and slowly drew a line in front of her neck, making a throat-slitting action. This action made the hairs on Big Beard's back stand on end. His face turned pale. The arrow in his hand could not be aimed accurately. Even drawing the bow became laborious. However, he suddenly bit the tip of his tongue. His heart trembled. He knew that he had met his match. When he was young, he had heard from his father that there was a kind of person in this world who had suffered all kinds of hardships and experienced great ups and downs. Their wisdom far surpassed that of ordinary people. Therefore, their gazes could really affect the thoughts of ordinary people. They could really kill. Life and death in a single thought were not empty word. However, he would not give in. He was Lu Yi's most powerful warrior. He could fight with the most ferocious wolf pack. He was not afraid. No matter how fierce she was, she still had her humanity. Could she be compared to a wild beast? However, when he aimed again, he saw Gong Yimo pull out the arrow from her shoulder. Then, she turned her hand and stabbed it into the eye socket of the first pursuer. That unhesitant ruthlessness caused the bearded man's arrow to miss. It shot into the neck of another pursuer. Blood splattered. However, his hands were trembling. He could not believe that he had missed. Chapter 170. General Lu Yi, who never missed his target, actually had a moment where he missed. Was there something wrong with his eyes? No, there was nothing wrong with his eyes. It was Gong Yimo's move that was too ruthless. From pulling out the arrow to piercing the enemy's eye socket, her actions were completely subconscious. There was only death, no humanity. She was a beast. The blood on Gong Yimo's body fell on Gong Dai's face. He almost immediately knew that it was Gong Yimo's blood. This strong stimulation caused him to suddenly open his eyes. Then, he watched as she pulled out the arrow and pierced another person's eye. Because he had pulled out the arrow, the blood that gushed out once again splattered on his face and flowed into his mouth. This feeling was exactly the same as when she had hugged him in her arms and fought with the emperor all those years ago. At that time, his mouth and nose knocked on her injured shoulder. The smell of rust flowed into his mouth and imprinted on his heart. Ah, this was his lover. Gong Dai wanted to scream and roar. The person he loved was injured. The blood seemed to have splashed into his eyes. The whole world turned blood red. Wake up, can't you see that the person you love is suffering for you? As if feeling Gong Dai's burning gaze, Gong Yimo felt that it was inconceivable. Gong Dai looked like he was still conscious. His willpower was really strong and terrifying. Gong Yimo, who was running, did not have time to stop. She only reached out and touched his eyes. Her lungs were burning. She gasped and said a few words in a hoarse voice. Don't look. After thinking for a while, she added another sentence. It's too ugly. Yes, she was now in a difficult situation. Gong Ju liked her, so she didn't want him to see such an ugly side of her. Once again, he was forced to close his eyes. Gong Dai could not help but cry. A drop of tear fell into his temple and his whole body was trembling. Men don't cry easily, but with just one look, her appearance tore his heart into pieces, and he was in so much pain that he wished he was dead. If it weren't for him, even if Gong Yimo had caused a huge mess in Daiyu State, she could have concealed her identity and moved to another country to live a carefree life. And his self-righteous protection had put her in danger. He thought that his love was noble and he was willing to give up everything for it. Little did he know that his love was selfish. It was precisely because he wanted to capture her and keep her by his side that she was in such a difficult position and in such a sorry state. However, she had never complained about him. Instead, she was vexed that she was unable to reciprocate his deep feelings. Every time he gave her something, She wanted to repay him tenfold, but she never thought about how many disasters he had brought to her. This was his lover. He wanted to hold on to her tightly, but he kept hurting her and making things difficult for her. She was someone he loved to the bone. No wonder she wasn't moved. It was because he hadn't done enough, far from enough. He wasn't worthy of her. Seeing that the imperial city was right in front of him, Gongsha couldn't hold back anymore. He wanted to keep her at all cost. However, the bearded man waved his hand and left with the rest of his men with an inexplicable expression. Originally, he had agreed to encircle and annihilate Gong Yimo because he wanted to take the opportunity to kill Gong Dai. However, the figure that protected Gong Dai with her life, the figure that made his heart tremble in fear, was worthy of his respect. Therefore, he didn't continue to pester her. He looked forward to the day when they would meet on the battlefield. However, even though there was one less party, there were still many pursuers. Many pursuers. Gong Yimo felt that her hand that was wielding the sword had become heavy, but she couldn't fall. She couldn't die in a place like this, or be captured by others and experience the torment of hell again. At this time, the sound of horse hooves could be heard from afar. Gong Yimo narrowed her eyes and looked up. Gong Shi and the rest gradually panicked. At this time, no matter who it was, it would be bad news to him. His gloomy eyes landed on Gong Yimo unwillingly. She was so close. Just a little bit more. The battle was still ongoing. Seeing that he couldn't take down Gong Yimo today, he was extremely unwilling. However, without external help and suffering heavy losses, he could only accept this great loss. Before the cavalry arrived, he gritted his teeth and led his men to withdraw. A fast horse broke away from the group and galloped over. That person's face was like jade. Even in the night, it was like a pearl, bright and dazzling. Gong Yimo. Shun Shiyi's voice seemed to have drained all of Gong Yimo's strength. She knelt on one knee and hugged Gong Dai tightly with both hands. Shun Shiyi ordered everyone to chase after her, but he knelt on one knee in front of Gong Yimo. He wanted to reach out and brush away the sweat and blood on her forehead, but he didn't dare. He was afraid that he would break her. How are you? Just as he was panicking and hesitating, Gong Yimo slowly and solemnly handed the person in her arms to him. Shun Shiyi saw that it was Gong Dai and was even more shocked. Help me take care of him. Her voice was so soft that it was almost inaudible. What about you? Gong Yimo smiled slightly. There was only one possibility for Shun Shiyi to appear here. That is, the emperor was convinced that she was still alive and sent Shun Shiyi to catch her. So now, she couldn't turn back. Sure enough, after saying this, Shun Shiyi shut his mouth in annoyance and looked at her worriedly. Gong Yimo fed herself a rejuvenation pill and felt her dried-up dantian heat up. Only then did she feel a little better. Now, there is no place for me in the capital. I will just leave. After saying this, she pursed her dry lips and looked at Gong Dai, who seemed to be asleep. She let out a sigh of relief and smiled. I will entrust him to you. Shun Shiyi's lips moved. He was under the emperor's orders, but he couldn't say anything, even if he wanted her to stay and recuperate. Gong Yimo looked at Gong Dai again. After thinking for a bit, she lowered her head and whispered in his ear in a voice that only the two of them could hear. You said you love me. Then when we meet again, show me your strength. She didn't give any promises or words of encouragement. She just used her usual provocative style to say this sentence. But this sentence undoubtedly recognized him and meant that she was giving him a chance. If Gong Dai was awake, he would definitely be very happy. After saying this, she looked deeply at Gong Dai and then got up to leave. Shun Shiyi couldn't help but ask in a panic. Where will you go? Gong Yimo didn't answer, but that proud and upright figure, in a sorry state, revealed a sense of heroism. The world was big, where couldn't she go? She was a natural eagle, not a canary raised in the backyard. That figure gradually swallowed up by the night made Shun Shiyi smile helplessly. It was because of this that he liked her. This was great. He came under the emperor's orders to capture people, but he just let them go. He didn't know how to suppress this matter. Thinking about this, he resigned himself to his fate and carried Gong Dai into the city. Gong Dai was unbelievably quiet. Shun Shiyi couldn't help but think that if he was awake, He definitely wouldn't let her go so easily. But he didn't know what kind of transformation Gong Dai had experienced this night. His face was like a perfect sculpture under the moonlight, but there seemed to be something new between his eyebrows, as if it had been sublimated. Chapter 171. It was like a dream. In the dream, she was wearing a light green gauze dress and was still sitting on the rocking chair. The shade of the tree was still mottled on her body, and the sound of cicadas and birds was in her ears. If that person is a burden to you, if that person makes you suffer, why don't you let go? She tilted her head slightly, as if she couldn't understand. Gong Dai reached out to touch her, but it was like touching the moon in the water. He couldn't touch her, but her curious eyes stared at him without blinking, waiting for his answer. Because she makes me happier. Gong Dai suddenly opened his eyes. In front of him was a familiar curtain. He was in Qi Manor. He had returned. Your Highness. Lo Qi was very surprised to see Gong Dai awake. Your Highness. Do you feel uncomfortable anywhere? When Gong Dai was sent back by Shun Shiyi, Lo Qi was really frightened. He clearly looked like he was asleep, but he couldn't wake him up. He was completely unaware of the outside world. Now that he was awake, it was good. Gong Dai looked at him blankly, then closed his eyes again. He heard Gong Yimo's last sentence clearly and vaguely, like a dream. You said you love me. Then when we meet again, show me your strength. She seemed to be smiling, and her tone was as happy as if her prank had succeeded. She still left, but he didn't know why. Although he was disappointed, he felt more satisfied. After the repeated provocations last night, her frozen heart seemed to have been cracked by him. Although it was only a small crack, he believed that other than him, no one else could cause that crack to flare up. If they meet again, then so be it. He believed that if they met again, she would definitely be subdued by him. Your Highness. Lo Qi worriedly called out again. Gong Dai's eyes were still closed, but he asked, yesterday, did you catch Nan of Gojosian? Lo Qi quickly said, we caught him. Fortunately, we reacted in time. He almost sneaked out of the city. At this moment, Gong Dai slowly got up and opened his eyes. Her ink-black hair slid down to her chest. When she opened her eyes again, there seemed to be a flicker of light in her cold eyes. There was a kind of dangerous and frightening beauty. She still looked the same, but Lo Qi felt that Her Highness was different. It was as if something had broken through and changed qualitatively, becoming more mature and tenacious. Bring Nan of Gojosian with you. Let's enter the palace. Lo Qi was stunned for a moment. When he came back to his senses, he disagreed and said worriedly, Your Highness, you haven't recovered yet. Why are you in such a hurry to enter the palace? Gong Dai smiled faintly. His eyes were cold. Of course, I have to rush before everyone else and go to Imperial Father to beg for forgiveness. After yesterday, the Emperor must have been estranged from him, but it didn't matter. He could feel that the Emperor still cherished his royal sister. Therefore, he had to seize the opportunity and use this pity to make the Emperor let go of his royal sister for the time being. After all, she was now seriously injured and could no longer endure the torment of those wolves and leopards in the capital. Moreover, he wanted power. What he wanted was not only the power to protect Gong Yimo, but also the power to turn around and attack others. The power to make everyone fear him. Thinking of this, he clenched his fists and was determined to win. When they met again, he wanted to give her the most reassuring thing. He wanted everyone to submit to him and not be trampled on by his royal sister. When Gong Yimo opened her eyes, she was shocked to find herself in the carriage. She couldn't hold on and fainted. She felt that her body was carefully bandaged. Was she saved by someone? Hey, you're finally awake. A familiar voice sounded. When Gong Yimo opened her eyes, she was dazzled by the other party's face, which was more beautiful and exquisite than a woman's. His eyes moved and the carriage lit up. He sighed faintly, if you don't wake up, what about the deal from before? I can't let my shiny silver go to waste. Gong Yimo's mouth twitched. Don't worry. As long as I'm still alive, the money, little, cough, won't be forgotten. Kim Yoon smiled faintly and deliberately looked at her with a disdainful expression. It's not good to boast. What I see is just a penniless and homeless little girl. Tell me, Where did the money come from? Gong Yimo was speechless. Indeed, not only did she not have a place to stay in Daiyu State, but the money in her hands was also in Gong Dai's hands. In order to prevent Gong Dai from finding her, she would definitely not use these resources. So she was really poor and had nothing. She rolled her eyes and whimpered as she lay on her back. Indeed, riches and honor are like fleeting clouds to me. It's gone again. Her exaggerated appearance made Kim Yoon laugh. As a grown man, he could be said to be in his most perfect state. His handsome face comforted Gong Yimo. Fortunately, although she was poor, there was still a handsome man to look at. It was not a loss at all. She rubbed her stomach and felt a little hungry. When she saw the food and wine on the short table beside her, she quickly got up and wolfed it down. When she saw Kim Yoon looking at her with some disdain, she laughed mischievously. "Tell me, how did you find me? How long have I been unconscious?" Kim Yoon would not tell her that he was hiding among the people who came to visit Yuheng. He did not want to expose himself, but when he heard someone say that Gong Yimo was still alive at the relay station, he could not sit still and ran out with people. However, he did not know the direction and could only use the most foolish method to search around the capital. He was lucky. When many people thought that Gong Yimo had fallen into the hands of Shun Shiyi, the emperor, he found her in a haystack. So he said casually, "I just wanted to go back to my country. Who knew that I would meet you, so I picked you up and brought you along. As for how long I was unconscious, it should be 4 or 5 days." Gong Yimo rubbed her stomach when she heard this. No wonder she was so hungry. "Wait, you're talking about going back to your country?" Kim Yoon glanced at her, his eyes moving with charm. "What else? There is no place for you in Daiyu State. You, come with me to Yuheng to play." Gong Yimo was shocked, but after thinking about it, she realized that he was right. This lousy place made her feel confused. She could not stay here. So she angrily took a bite of the pastry and said incoherently, "Okay, let's go to Yuheng." Kim Yoon smiled proudly. Yuheng, an oval-shaped country sandwiched between Luyi and Daiyu State. It was the smallest of the 4 major countries, and its people were very harmonious. It had the valiance of the nomads and the elegance of the Han people in the south. It was very special. However, Yuheng's royal family blindly worshipped the prosperity of Daiyu State. They had only learned the extravagant side and were already showing signs of decline. The carriage entered Yuheng smoothly. When they saw that it was Kim Yoon's carriage, many people cheered. "The second prince is back." The people passed the news to each other. Many young girls even threw silk handkerchiefs in their hands onto the carriage. Gong Yimo clicked her tongue when she saw this. "I didn't expect you to be so popular in the country." Chapter 172. Gong Yimo's casual words made Kim Yoon frown slightly. He sighed and said to the coachman, "Go straight to the palace." "Yes." Thus, the group did not stop and went straight to the Yuheng Imperial Palace. Unexpectedly, they were stopped at the entrance of the palace. The guard at the entrance casually bowed, but his eyes were staring at the curtain of the carriage, as if he wanted to take a look at the beauty. "Your Highness, they have to search before they are willing to let her go." The coachman opened the curtain and said with some difficulty. Gong Yimo was stunned. Wasn't Kim Yoon a prince? Why did they have to search? There were so many people coming and going. If they really searched the prince's carriage in front of everyone, Kim Yoon would be so shameless. Sure enough, Kim Yoon's expression was also very ugly. He took out a banknote and handed it to the coachman. And in the cold palace, a terrible scene was playing out. The originally clean and warm room was now in a mess. A woman's screams and cries could be heard, accompanied by a man's angry curses. "Slut. After staying in the cold palace for so long, don't you want a man? Jun will satisfy you." A middle-aged man pressed a weak woman on the bed, and a group of people were guarding outside the door. No matter how the woman resisted, it was useless. Yoon Jin was pressed firmly on the bed. She cried like a pear blossom, but other than crying, she could do nothing. If she really resisted too much, it was very likely to implicate Yoon. Forget it, she was already a withered flower, so what was the harm in that? Seeing Yoon Jin gradually stop moving and only cry, Emperor Jin Sheng of the Yuheng Empire, who was tearing her clothes, raised his head, suddenly grabbed her chin, and said fiercely, "What are you crying for? You are Zhen's woman. Zhen dotes on you, and you are not happy. Smile for Zhen. Zhen wants you to smile." Yun Jin was so scared that her face turned pale. She did not dare to cry again, but she could never smile. Jin Sheng's slightly swollen eyes glanced coldly at the door. "You don't want to laugh, right? That little bastard should be back today. If you don't smile, we will make him cry for you to see." As he spoke, he chuckled, "Don't say, that little beast is getting more and more beautiful. I wonder what it's like to play with it. You. Yun Jin was so angry that she trembled when she saw his lewd eyes. "He's your son." "Bah!" Jin Sheng said fiercely, "He has a dirty mother. Who knows whose son he is?" With that said, he couldn't be bothered to argue with her and scoffed, "Jin is asking you, are you going to laugh or not?" Yun Jin was shocked by the fierceness in his eyes, and tears fell from her temples again. I'll laugh. With that said, she revealed a very miserable smile. But a beauty was a beauty. No matter how stiff her expression was, she still had the delicate beauty of a weeping pear blossom. Her meekness made Jin Sheng very satisfied. Soon, the woman's painful whimpers sounded. She moaned softly, as if she was in so much pain that she was in despair. Kim Yoon waited anxiously outside Jin Tang Palace. At this time, a person who looked like a eunuch walked out and arrogantly snorted, "Your Highness, please return. His Majesty is not willing to see you." Jin Yoon's face stiffened, and he hurriedly stuffed several banknotes into the eunuch's hands. The eunuch's face immediately changed when he secretly glanced at the face value. He quickly put away the banknotes and pretended to sigh. "Your Highness, please return. It's not that His Majesty is not willing to see you, but that His Majesty is not here." With that, he turned and left. This simple sentence received 1,000 taels from Kim Yoon. Gong Yimo lowered her head and was slightly speechless. "What a nouveau riche. Oh no!" Kim Yoon suddenly exclaimed and ran away. Gong Yimo hurriedly followed. She had changed into men's clothing and was sitting beside him like a waiter. "What's wrong?" Gong Yimo was a little puzzled and asked as she ran. She saw that in just a short while, Kim Yoon's forehead was covered in a layer of cold sweat. The muscles on his face twitched, and his expression was unprecedentedly cold. "Imperial Father is not in the main palace." "It's very likely." He tightly shut his mouth. It was very likely that he had gone to the cold palace. Along the way, there were constantly people casting faint disdainful glances at Kim Yoon. No one even came up to greet him. How could Kim Yoon have the mood to care about these things? He ran all the way. When he arrived at the cold palace, it was already surrounded by the Imperial Guards. "Imperial Father really came to find Imperial Mother, Your Second Highness. His Majesty has decreed that no one is allowed to enter." The guard looked greedily and disdainfully at Kim Yoon's face. There was no trace of respect in his words, only mockery. Kim Yoon panicked. He touched his body and was about to give him some banknotes as a bribe when he heard a woman's scream. He immediately froze. It was Imperial Mother. It was Imperial Mother's voice. Before he could say anything, a person wearing a dragon robe with disheveled clothes strode out. His body was stained with blood, and his face was so gloomy that it was dripping water. Bad luck. What bad luck? The moment he stepped out, Kim Yoon stared at him for a long time. It was only when Gong Yimo secretly tugged at his sleeve that he fell to his knees and said in a low voice, "Greetings to Imperial Father." When Jin Sheng saw that it was Kim Yoon, his expression became even worse. He snorted coldly. "That bitch of a mother of yours wants to die. Go collect her corpse." As he spoke, he led the others to walk away. His words frightened Kim Yoon. Before the emperor had gone far, he staggered in. "Imperial Mother." When Kim Yoon entered the courtyard, he saw that the door was wide open and it was a mess. When he entered, he saw that there was a bloody mark on Yoon Jin's shoulder. This made his soul fly out of his body and his face turned pale. Yoon Jin cried softly. She originally wanted to endure, but at the last moment, she was overcome with grief and wanted to die. However, Yuheng Emperor quickly blocked her. Her last stab stabbed into the shoulder and not the neck. She had a weak personality. Although she was in the cold palace, because Kim Yoon spared no effort to take care of her, she was not affected by the conspiracies of the harem. As a result, even though she was in her 30s, she was still as innocent as 18. Her face seemed to be as young as her heart. Even though she did not take care of it, she was still as beautiful as a woman in her 20s. When Gong Yimo saw that the room was in chaos, she blocked the door and let the others guard the courtyard entrance. She walked in. Her mother seemed to be injured. She might be able to help. After entering, she saw that on the messy bed, a beautiful woman was leaning on Kim Yoon's arm and crying bitterly. Her shoulder was still bleeding, and Kim Yoon was kneeling by the bed. His eyes were red, but he did not know what to do. Gong Yimo walked over and sighed softly. "Your Highness, I have medicine in my hand. Your Highness, please wait outside for a moment. I will bandage Her Highness." When Kim Yoon heard this, he looked at her blankly. However, when he saw the determination in her eyes, he seemed to wake up and nodded repeatedly. When he got up, he looked at his mother who was lying on the bed in so much pain that she wanted to die. His Adam's apple moved and he said softly, "Imperial Mother has a weak personality. I am afraid that she will take things too hard. Please." Gong Yimo nodded. Chapter 173. Kim Yoon sighed and left. Gong Yimo waited for a while. When her hand touched Madame Yoon Jin, the latter had stopped crying. She stared at the dagger on the ground as if she was in a daze. She allowed Yoon Jin to manipulate the dagger without taking her eyes off it. Gong Yimo sighed and said as she used the Yurong powder in her space to apply medicine to her. "Your Highness probably hasn't seen me before." When Gong Yimo spoke, she saw that the other party didn't say a word. She continued, "I was picked up by His Highness on the way back to the country. His Highness is really a kind person." When she mentioned Kim Yoon, a trace of sadness flashed across Yoon Jin's eyes, but the will to die did not disappear. She was a mentally weak person who liked to dwell on insignificant problems. After being treated like that by the Emperor today, she had no other thoughts other than death. Gong Yimo saw the bruises on her body, but she didn't care. She continued, "His Highness is good at everything, but he's too shrewd. On the way, I saw him bringing the goods he bought in Dayu State to Yuheng to sell. He didn't forget to do this kind of profiteering when he went to offer birthday wishes. I saw that many people didn't understand His Highness's self-degrading actions, and I didn't understand it either." When she saw that Yoon Jin was listening, she continued, "Although he got a lot of money, he also lost the dignity of a prince. I asked him if money was important. He said that money was the most adorable thing in the world. It's really too embarrassing. His Highness seems to have a lot of businesses and earns a lot of money every day. But such a rich person is so stingy. I saw that he only changed a few pieces of clothing. He really doesn't look like a prince. I'm almost wondering if I followed the wrong person." When Yoon Jin heard this, she glanced at her. She saw that she was pouting, as if she was annoyed that she didn't see the right person. Was this her son's waiter? Was she telling the truth? Yuna had never told her about it. But when I returned to the capital today, I realized that I was wrong. Your Highness is really generous. Gong Yimo narrowed her eyes and said, "When we entered the palace, the guards made things difficult for us both openly and secretly. He gave us 500 taels at once. Just now in the Golden Hall, for a slightly more accurate piece of information, he gave us another 1,000 taels. No wonder he's usually so stingy." At this point, Gong Yimo tilted her head slightly and looked at her, as if she didn't understand. "It's just that I'm a little curious. Your Highness, can you please tell me? Why is it that Kim Yoon is clearly a prince, but even the eunuch at the gate can make things difficult for him as he pleases? Why do you think?" Her words caused Yoon Jin to be shocked and angry. Tears once again gushed out of her eyes. So Yuna had been living such a hard life. She was useless as a mother and had dragged Yoon down. Gong Yimo's fingers quickly tied a bow on her shoulder, admiring it for a moment. "Your Highness, you also think that His Second Highness has a hard life, right?" She laughed mischievously, but changed the topic. "But he's working so hard because he wants you to have a better life. He once told me that in the Cold Palace, He has to bribe more than 1,000 taels of silver every month. I see that although your house is simple, it has everything you need. It can be seen that he's working so hard to earn money for you. Now that he's 20 years old and has a handsome appearance, no one wants to marry him. Don't say any more. Yoon Jin let out a low whimper. Her beautiful eyes looked at Gong Yimo pleadingly, begging her not to say any more. It was as if she didn't say anything, these things wouldn't exist. But look, what have you done? His future is bleak and he can't move forward. And you're still causing trouble for him. Gong Yimo stood up and walked around the room. Just now, when the emperor wanted to touch you, you made such a big fuss and even wanted to die. Is it because there's someone in your heart? Gong Yimo's words scared Yoon Jin so much that she forgot to cry. She did have someone she loved. That person was a musician in the palace, but after the emperor took her away, that person disappeared without a trace. Because of that person, even though she was forcefully taken by the emperor, she was always in pain. Later, she was framed for having an affair and was banished to the cold palace. But she didn't expect that even after being banished to the cold palace, the nightmare didn't end. The emperor still came to find her. Gong Yimo couldn't help but sneer. Kim Yoon, he's the emperor's biological son, right? How could such a disgraceful thing be faked? Yoon Jin was also angered and said firmly, Yoon is naturally His Majesty's biological son. Gong Yimo clicked her tongue and suddenly approached her, looking down at her. Then I don't understand. Sleeping with him once is sleeping with him twice is sleeping. You've already given birth to a child. Instead of thinking about the well-being of the child, you've repeatedly implicated your own biological son for a man who probably doesn't even like you. Are you Kim Yoon's biological mother? Her words made Yoon Jin's face turn pale. What did she know? How scary was this harem? Those women looked at her as if they wanted to swallow her alive. She didn't like the palace, and she didn't like the emperor. She wanted to leave so badly. That person said that he would come back to save her. She didn't do anything wrong by staying chaste. Gong Yimo crossed her arms and looked at her faintly. There's a saying that is true. Women, once they've been found to have done something wrong, they'll go all the way. You're quite stubborn. Once you've been wrong for more than 10 years. Gong Yimo knew that this kind of person couldn't be coaxed. The more you coaxed, the more pretentious she would be. On the other hand, if you mocked and ridiculed her, she would be more receptive. Madame Yoon Jin looked at her in a daze. No one had ever said such words to her. The emperor doted on her, and then he abused her. Her sweetheart was obedient to her. Even her son was very sensible and coaxed her in everything. She was still thinking about it when she saw the other party lift her clothes and squat down to look at her. The aura she revealed made Yoon Jin, this little woman, involuntarily shrink back. She suddenly became alert. Who was this waiter dressed like? Why was he so special that he would say such words to her and make her feel afraid? Come, woman who's blinded by love. You haven't told me yet. Are you Kim Yoon's biological mother? Yoon Jin lightly bit her lips like a frightened rabbit. After a while, she said, Of course I am. Then tell me again. You've been in the cold palace for so many years. Other than your son being filial to you, enduring being scolded and trampled by others, and persisting in taking care of you and doing his best to make your life more comfortable, has that great hero in your heart ever come to find you? Thinking of that tall and sturdy man and Gong Yimo's words, her pale lips trembled. For a while, she couldn't say anything. He didn't come. He didn't come even once. Perhaps he was already dead and she wouldn't be able to leave the palace for the rest of her life. Thinking of this, Yoon Jin grieved and tears fell again. Chapter 174. Gong Yimo rolled her eyes. Can you stop crying? Do you know how much of a burden you've brought to your son? And you're still crying. If it weren't for you, he could have been carefree and happy with his wives and concubines. He might even have had a chance to fight for that position. But because of you, he's been looked down upon and humiliated. And you've been hiding in the cold palace, not thinking or looking at anything. When you see that he's injured, you cry and cry. I'm afraid that he'll have to turn around and comfort you. Let me ask you, Have you never thought deeply about it and not felt ashamed? What's in your head? She was straightforward and harsh. Yoon-jin couldn't take it anymore. Yes, she was useless except for being a burden. Now that her last bit of hope had been ruthlessly trampled on by Gong Yimo, she suddenly wailed and threw herself to the ground, trying to snatch the dagger on the ground. Gong Yimo watched her fall to the ground and didn't care. Instead, she quickly ran to lock the door. Hearing such a loud noise, Kim Yoon quickly knocked on the door. However, Gong Yimo ignored Kim Yoon's urgent questioning and blocked the door. She coldly watched as Yoon-jin placed the dagger on her neck. She looked calm and unruffled, as if waiting for her to stab her. Stab her. What are you waiting for? Gong Yimo stood in front of the door and looked at the woman on the ground. At this moment, her beautiful eyes were wide open. The tip of the dagger that was almost at her neck was trembling, but she couldn't stab her. Gong Yimo smiled. Such a weak person. She was afraid of everything, yet she still blamed the heavens and blamed others. Are you waiting for him to come in and save you? Don't think about it. I'll watch the door for you. If you want to die, then die. Kim Yoon couldn't hear what was said inside. He kept knocking on the door, but no one responded. Yoon-jin gritted her teeth several times. She resented Gong Yimo's cold-bloodedness. Forget it. Since no one in this world could tolerate her, she might as well die. As she thought about it, she suddenly swung her hand down, but Gong Yimo caught her hand at the last moment. She exerted her strength, but her strength was not enough. The dagger did not move an inch. Gong Yimo pinched her fingers. She cried out in pain and the dagger fell to the ground. How dare you? At this moment, her hair was in a mess, and she felt as if she had been raped. She burst into tears. Who are you? What right do you have to control me? Don't you want me to die? I'll die for you to see. Gong Yimo was not as aggressive as before. She reached out and touched Yoon-jin's hair. Perhaps it was because her actions were too strange and gave off a strong feeling. Yoon-jin cried a few times. Later, she did not dare to cry anymore, because she knew that Gong Yimo would not coax her. Gong Yimo touched her hair and chuckled. You're not even afraid of death, but you're still afraid of being touched by the emperor? Her words made Yoon-jin's face turn white and red. She seemed to want to refute, but she did not know how to. You're not even afraid of death, but you're afraid of the women in the harem? If you're not even afraid of death, why don't you curry favor with the emperor and make it up to your son? If you're not even afraid of death, why can't you be more strong-willed and leave the cold palace to find that man? You're waiting for someone to save you. Why can't you consider the possibility of saving yourself? Gong Yimo patted her face and sighed with a smile. I think your heart is higher than the sky, but your life is thinner than paper. The emperor still came to find you in the cold palace. It can be seen that glory, splendor, and wealth are at your fingertips. But it's fine if you pretend to refuse, but you still want to implicate your son again. Listen to how anxious he is outside. Gong Yimo grabbed her shoulder to calm her down and listen. Kim Yoon was already banging on the door. He was so anxious, as if he was afraid that Gong Yimo would harm her. This made Yoon-jin feel ashamed for the first time. Gong Yimo picked up the dagger again and stuffed it into her hand. TSK, I'll return it to you. Whether you want to commit suicide or kill someone else, I don't care. With that, she clapped her hands and got up to open the door. After opening the door, Kim Yoon rushed in. He did not even look at Gong Yimo, but directly pounced on Madame Yoon-jin on the ground. Mother, what's wrong with you? As if she was still dreaming, she was suddenly pulled into reality. Yoon-jin grabbed Kim Yoon's hand and looked at Gong Yimo fearfully. She hid behind him and asked timidly, Yoon, are you having a hard time outside? Kim Yoon felt a little strange. He quickly said, it's not hard. She hadn't said anything yet, but her son had said that it wasn't hard. It was obvious that he was really lying to her. Yoon-jin burst into tears again. How stupid and naive was she? She had stayed in the cold palace for more than 10 years and was immersed in those ridiculous thoughts. Had she neglected the most important person? Today, if this person did not wake her up, she did not know how long she would be in a daze. Seeing her cry, Kim Yoon was already used to it and quickly comforted her. Yoon Jin glanced at Gong Yimo, stood up by herself and walked towards her. "Milord." She bowed and said with tears in her eyes, "This servant's life has been ruined. I have no more hope. I only hope that Milord can help my son. This servant was wrong before, but it's too late to regret. Please help him, Milord." She originally thought that she would say those words to her and deliberately stimulate her and wake her up. She would definitely help her son. Who knew that Gong Yimo would grin? "If you want to help him yourself." She still did not move. Gong Yimo said those words just to let her do it herself. Unfortunately, some people were used to being weak and could not stand up with just a few words. She was not a savior, nor was he her son. She did not want to burden herself. Seeing Gong Yimo leave just like that, Yoon Jin did not come back to her senses for a long time. She did not understand. She had clearly admitted that she was wrong, but why did that milord still look dissatisfied? She did not know that a person with a weak personality like her would subconsciously rely on others even if she was reminded. It would be strange if Gong Yimo was satisfied with this. However, Yoon Jin seemed to admire Gong Yimo very much. She thought that the other party must be a very capable strategist. She must not make the other party leave because of her weak personality. Thus, she wiped her tears and repeatedly urged Kim Yoon to look for her. Kim Yoon sighed and said, "Mother, she's my friend. It's all right." Yoon Jin was slightly relieved. Then, she recalled what Gong Yimo said before and was stunned. She had probably never suffered such a big blow. Kim Yoon was a little uneasy. "Mother, what exactly did she say to you?" At the mention of this, Yoon Jin wanted to cry again. However, in any case, she had been shocked by Gong Yimo once. She was traumatized and stopped crying after a few cries. She only said that she was a good person and wanted Kim Yoon to treat her well. Meanwhile, in the Golden Hall Palace, Jin Sheng chased all the women out and smashed all the famous porcelain in sight. The evil fire in her heart could not be suppressed. That woman, who exactly was she protecting her body for? Chapter 175. His anger alarmed an Avsilla, who was reviewing memorials in the side hall. That's right, the Emperor's memorials were all reviewed by others. However, he was very cunning. He didn't call one person, but 3 people to take turns reviewing the memorials. An Avsilla was one of his younger brothers, and he looked very gentle. "Why is your Majesty so angry?" Jin Sheng glanced at him and gritted his teeth. "Isn't it because of that bitch in the cold palace?" An Avsilla smiled. "If you ask me, since Imperial brother can't forget her, you should let her out. How can that be?" Jin Sheng suddenly raised his voice and looked at him gloomily. "That bitch? Let her out to cause chaos in the palace?" An Avsilla looked at his resolute attitude and smiled faintly. "Your Majesty, you don't have to be so angry. Don't you value her because you think she's beautiful? That bastard son of hers isn't bad either." His words made the Emperor, who didn't care about sex, hesitate. Although he was muddle-headed and lecherous and had a few male concubines in his harem, he still had some rationality. Although it was uncertain whether Kim Yoon was his son, he was still a little hesitant to do such a thing. An Avsilla said, "The second prince is very popular among the people now. The people don't know the truth and have been deceived by him. Is your Majesty going to be merciful? If he continues to grow, the eldest prince won't be able to suppress him when he inherits the throne. He dares." Jin Sheng was a little angry. He's just the son of a songstress. Does he want to overturn the heavens? An Avsilla's eyes shone faintly. "Who said that? The human heart is always greedy." By the time Jin Yoon came out, it was already evening. Gong Yimo was lying alone on the wall of the cold palace, her hands behind her head as she looked at the sunset. She had a piece of withered grass in her mouth, and there was an indescribable sense of loneliness. There was not much difference between Yuheng and Dai Yu State. The sky was the same, and people looked the same. Why did she have a faint feeling of homesickness? It must be an illusion. Jin Yoon walked over and stood at the foot of the wall. He sighed and said, "Princess, my mother's nature is like this. If there's anything you don't like, please forgive her." Gong Yimo spat out the grass in her mouth. She tilted her head and said calmly, You, a person who was implicated, didn't say anything. How can an outsider like me have any opinions? He smiled faintly. Every move he made was shockingly beautiful. What are you talking about? She is my mother, the most important person in my life. Gong Yimo could not understand his filial piety. She only asked, why do I feel like they don't like you? Aren't you the emperor's son? At the mention of this, Jin Yun's lips curled into a bitter smile. When I was born, my father was especially happy. Because my mother was favored, my status also rose. But later, someone framed my mother for an affair. After a thorough investigation, that man took poison and died. My father also became suspicious of my mother. Later, rumors spread everywhere in the harem. The concubines asked me to do a blood test. It was strange. I was clearly my father's son, but the blood just couldn't fuse together. He smiled bitterly. In a few words, he summarized those turbulent and dark years. But at that time, Imperial Grandfather stood up. He believed that I was the son of the imperial family. He even said that when he was young, he had heard that even the blood of blood couldn't fuse together. So, he protected me. But since then, my father was deeply suspicious of my mother. He often beat and scolded her. Plus, my mother. She didn't have any feelings for my father. So, after they parted on bad terms, she moved to the cold palace. As for me, I was raised under the name of the late empress. Gong Yimo nodded. I didn't expect your background to be so complicated. Not only did he have a muddle-headed singer mother, but he also had an even more muddle-headed father. Your grandfather was right. This kind of situation did happen. And looking at your mother, she wasn't someone who would cheat. Even if she had the heart, she definitely didn't have the gut. Her words made Kim Yoon's face look embarrassed. He came forward and used his strength to climb up the wall and sit beside her. In the end, he practiced dancing all year round, so his skills were quite good. He smiled. You don't have to sympathize with me. I was lucky. The late empress didn't have a son, so she took good care of me. My mother also had a better life. It's a pity that she died early, and some people took advantage of her. The some people he was talking about was probably the current empress. Gong Yimo looked at his overly dazzling face and said, your dance was also taught by your mother. He nodded a little bashfully. After she died, my situation became difficult. The other brothers ostracized me and scolded me, so I could only hide in the cold palace. As for my mother, she had a naive temperament, and her knowledge was limited. When I was young, I was always weak and sickly. My mother said that she had practiced dancing since she was young, and she never even caught a cold. So every time she practiced dancing in the courtyard, she would bring me along. Slowly, I actually learned how to dance. Speaking of this, he faintly smiled. He was a little self-deprecating, but at the same time, he felt very satisfied. Perhaps when he was young, hiding in the cold palace to practice dancing, it was one of the few times in his life that he felt happy. Then, why did you become a singer? This was what Gong Yimo couldn't understand the most. She couldn't see the slightest bit of the noble pride of a prince on Kim Yoon. He was like a beautiful wild grass. Not only could he put down his status to earn money, he could even abandon his male identity to become the most inferior singer. This was simply inconceivable in ancient times. When Kim Yoon heard this, he became even more embarrassed. There was a faint blush on his face, which made the clouds in the sky pale in comparison. He sighed softly, as if he didn't care, but also as if he cared. Because I was really short of money. My father didn't care about me and left me to fend for myself. My brothers ostracized me, and the palace people looked down on me. Only money could allow me to survive and live a better life. As a singer, not only could I earn money, my mother could also live a more comfortable life in the cold palace. I could also spare the energy to help the poor common people. I could also inquire about news and know about the world's movements. After a long time, I didn't care. Even if you abandoned your male identity, you didn't care. Gong Yimo's words stung him, causing his expression to stiffen for a moment. After a long time, he slowly exhaled. I didn't care. He turned his head and stared at Gong Yimo. Those beautiful eyes seemed to be filled with stars. In this world, other than death, everything is trivial. Then, he raised his head and looked at the sky. There was a trace of unyielding will and yearning in his expression. And living, isn't there only one goal? That is to do everything possible to live well, and to continue living. Looking at the side of his face that was slightly raised, this was a person. He was clearly suffering, but he still maintained hope and enthusiasm. He was clearly tired, but he could still take care of his mother and take care of the poor common people. Gong Yimo suddenly felt that this was what it meant to be born from the heart. He deserved the title of the #1 beauty in the world. Chapter 176. Kim Yoon's residence was located in the western part of the city. It was worth mentioning that the eastern part of the city was the wealthy area, while the western part was filled with commoners. Furthermore, his residence was once the residence of a second-rank military general. Not to mention its location, the area was small, but the decorations could be considered elegant. Gong Yimo looked around with slight disdain. This residence was not even a tenth of Gong Dai's Chi Manor, not to mention things like hot springs. I say, you're already rich, so do you need to be so stingy? I saw that some of the roof tiles are empty. Won't they leak when it rains? Kim Yoon indifferently glanced at her and said in annoyance, you really don't know the cost of daily necessities unless you're in charge. Those houses aren't for people to live in, so why do they need to be repaired? Gong Yimo was convinced. She sat in front of the table and poured herself a cup of tea. She said in annoyance, then tell me, what do you keep the money for? Is it all for others to use? Really, it's all in the pockets of those insatiable people. At this moment, a servant said, Your Highness, the Zhong family's old madam is here and insists on thanking you. Are you going to meet her or not? He was in a bit of a dilemma. Kim Yoon did not put on any airs. Naturally, I have to meet her. Let her in. Gong Yimo was impatient with these situations, so she went to the inner room. Not long after, an old lady limped in with the help of a young girl. When she saw Kim Yoon, she wanted to bow. No need to be so courteous. He seemed to be used to these situations. His tone and attitude were very gentle, completely lacking the demonic aura that he had in front of Gong Yimo. Are you feeling better? The old lady nodded repeatedly. Many thanks to Your Highness for your kindness. If not for Your Highness clearing my son's name, he would definitely have been killed in prison by those corrupt officials. I don't have much time left. Now, my son is recuperating at home and cannot move. I brought my granddaughter here to thank you first. When my son recovers, I will call him over to kowtow to you. You can't do that. Kim Yoon quickly reached out to support her and smiled. His smile was so beautiful that the little girl who was secretly looking at him blushed to her neck. After the old woman finished thanking them and personally sent them off, she helplessly returned with a bamboo basket. Inside the basket were some homemade items made by ordinary people. Although they weren't expensive, the thought that mattered was the most. Gong Yimo ran out to take a look and was convinced. You're really popular. Just now, that little girl was reluctant to leave when she saw you. I secretly watched her. It was her grandmother who pinched her before she left reluctantly. It's obvious that she cares about you. As she spoke, she raised her teacup and smiled mischievously. If you ask me, you're already so old. It's time for you to get married. Noble ladies are more scheming. It's not bad to marry a peasant girl. She knew that Kim Yoon wouldn't care about these things, so she said this sincerely. Kim Yoon glared at her. You little girl, can't you act like a lady? What marriage? You're really shameless. With his charming appearance, he seemed to have turned into the world's #1 beauty and not the amiable Kim Yoon from before. Gong Yimo sighed. Before she could say anything, someone else came. The difference was that this time, it was someone from the palace. In an instant, the two people's expressions became serious. The emperor had decreed that he should immediately enter the palace for an audience. The eunuch who announced the decree looked at him eagerly. Kim Yoon immediately understood and handed over a purse. He then smiled and said in a strange voice, Your Highness should prepare as soon as possible. I heard that it's Lu Yi's honored guest. After saying that, he walked away arrogantly. His words surprised Kim Yoon. After the eunuch left, he called someone over and asked, "Lu Yi, someone came. Why are you so quiet? Quickly go and investigate and come back to report." Yes. That person moved and hurriedly left. It seemed that he was a martial arts expert. Gong Yimo saw this. Although Kim Yoon's position was passive, he was rich and had a good character. He also had people who sincerely worked for him. Coupled with the convenience of his other identity, a lot of information that others couldn't find out couldn't reach his ears, so he wasn't so passive. After he changed his clothes, that person came back and said in a low voice, "It's indeed Lu Yi Snowball. Moreover, it's Lu Yi's Eagle King. His name is Rucha, but for some reason, King Lu Yi doesn't like him." Kim Yoon thought for a while and asked, "Since it's a banquet, even if it's a secret visit, I'm sure I'm not the only one who was invited, right?" The subordinate said, "I went out to ask just now. Other than our residents, the first prince's residence and the prince's residence also received the imperial edict. The strange thing is that none of the officials attended the banquet. I heard from Hong Miang that the prince is here to discuss something important. It's said that it has something to do with Dayu State." Kim Yoon waved his hand and dismissed him, indicating that he knew what was going on. After the subordinate left, Gong Yimo leisurely walked out and raised her eyebrows. "Eagle King Rucha?" She rolled her eyes and seemed to be deep in thought. Kim Yoon said, "Why? You even know Lu Yi's prince's background?" Gong Yimo smiled. "You think too highly of me. I don't know his background, but I know that he has some hobbies that few people know about. It's these hobbies that King Lu Yi doesn't like." When Kim Yoon heard this, he hurriedly poured her a cup of tea. "Please enlighten me, princess." If it was any other time, Gong Yimo would have joked with him. However, she was a little hesitant now. She looked at him and didn't know if she should tell him. This King Rucha is 9 feet tall and as strong as a wild beast. He can eat more than 10 jin of meat in a meal and is extremely strong. He's a famous warrior of Lu Yi. However, his needs in that area are much more intense than ordinary people. Women often can't stand it, so. When she said this, Kim Yoon's face paled. His hands on the table couldn't help but clench into fists. So he caused the deaths of many people. That's why King Lu Yi doesn't like him and thinks that he's tarnishing the reputation of the imperial family. Impossible, I'm imperial father's biological son. Gong Yimo smiled. I didn't say that it must be like this. She frowned and continued, it's just that, your imperial father obviously doesn't like you and is secretly meeting with King Lu Yi. However, he asked you to go. You should be more careful. Kim Yoon fell silent. The more he thought about it, the more ridiculous it was. Gong Yimo must be thinking too much. However, she did it out of kindness, so he nodded, indicating that he would be more careful. After understanding the situation, he prepared to enter the palace. However, he didn't want to bring Gong Yimo with him. After all, she was good-looking and would stand out more than other men in disguise. If King Lu Yi really took a fancy to her, what should he do? However, Gong Yimo waved her hand indifferently. Don't worry, I'm not going to follow you. I just want to go to the cold palace and find your imperial mother to have a heart-to-heart talk. Chapter 177. Far in the south, Dayu State was also shrouded in dark clouds. The emperor hated Gong Dai for hiding the truth. After dealing with Nan of Gojosian, he punished him with whipping and forbade him from receiving medical treatment. He had to kneel on the Temple of Heaven for 3 days and 3 nights. However, to everyone's disappointment, the emperor was so angry that he didn't take away the 50,000 imperial guards under his command. It could be seen that this punishment was all bark and no bite. In the cold weather, Gong Dai knelt on the snowy Temple of Heaven with his upper body bare. The crisscrossing whip marks on his body were shocking. However, he seemed to have lost consciousness and didn't move at all. He knelt until noon and his 3 days were up. At this time, his face was pale. There was no trace of the ruthlessness he had when he beheaded Nan of Gojosian. The day after Gong Yimo escaped, Gong Dai brought a bramble to ask for punishment. At that time, the emperor dismissed everyone and spoke to him. Many people thought that the emperor had let him go. They didn't expect that he would only be punished after Nan of Gojosian died. Many people thought that Gong Dai was lucky to run into Nan of Gojosian's plot to murder the emperor. This caused the emperor to not care about him and let him off lightly. However, Gongsha knew that the truth was far from that. When he walked far away, he gloomily glared at the figure in the snow. He couldn't accept it. He was so close. As long as Father Emperor used Nan of Gojosian's things a few times, he would have succeeded. However, Gong Dai knew about such a little-known thing and even used it to make up for his crimes. Otherwise, based on his crime of harboring Gong Yimo, he wouldn't have been whip. Moreover, Gong Dai seemed to have found something. The emperor's attitude towards him these days was much colder. The more Gongsha thought about it, the more he hated him. His eyes were filled with a sinister light. Just you wait. Count yourself lucky this time. Next time, I'll make sure you're dead. Gong Dai wasn't idle either. He knelt there, but in his heart, he was silently chanting the mantra to expel the cold and heal the wound. Wind and nature was a very profound martial art. Every style and every move was very exquisite. Gong Dai was even somewhat glad that he practiced this kind of martial art. His heart was already ruthless. If it was any other slightly more extreme martial art, it might have caused his temperament to change greatly, becoming cold-blooded and unpredictable. It was snowing lightly in the sky. At this moment, someone came from afar with an umbrella, causing Gong Dai to open his eyes. Did she really leave? Gong Che didn't seem to believe it. He felt that Gong Yimo must still be hiding somewhere in the capital, waiting to play a prank on him. Gong Dai's mentality had already become strong and mature, so he was no longer on guard against Gong Che. He believed that with his strength, he could defeat all men. She's gone. Even I don't know where she went. Gong Dai lightly said. Just because she was mentioned, a trace of tenderness and helplessness appeared on the youth's face. His royal sister was really too powerful. He used all his manpower to search for her, but there was no news of her. It had only been a few days, so it was impossible for her to disappear without a trace. The only explanation was that she was no longer in the country. Gong Che's knuckles turned slightly white as he gripped the umbrella. He was dressed in a snow-white robe, but this whiteness was not as pale as his face. She's gone. These two words were so light that they dissipated in the wind. The corner of his mouth revealed a trace of a bitter smile. This smile was actually uglier than crying. He thought of the upcoming wedding. The palace was decorated with lanterns and decorations every day. And the only person he wanted to show it to, that person had left. It was as if his counterattack didn't get a response. His heart was empty. Moreover, in an instant, he also sighed for his own stupidity. Those who were involved could not see clearly. At that time, he only saw that Gong Yimo had rejected him. He only wanted to hear what she said, but did not consider how dangerous her situation was. Now that he thought back on his actions during this period of time, he only felt that it was laughable. She was no longer around. This marriage, was there still a need to go through? Gong Dai sneered. Why do you care? Anyway, you're about to get married. Ninth brother is here to congratulate you. Gong Dai's words caused Gong Che's figure to sway. His eyes flashed with a trace of ruthlessness for no reason. He couldn't get married. If he got married, then he would really have no chance. Thinking of this, he looked at Gong Dai's back. He also couldn't offend the Duke. Gong Dai was gradually rising. He couldn't lose to him. Seeing Gong Che leave in a hurry, Gong Dai didn't even turn his head back. He was thinking in his heart, thinking about what his next step should be. Only, he looked at the grey sky and smiled slightly. Royal sister, you must guard your heart well. Because your heart can only be mine. Gong Yimo sneezed slightly. Looking at the anxious Madame Yun Jin in front of her, she leisurely ate her snacks. The palace banquet hasn't started yet. Why are you in such a hurry? She swayed back and forth, making her dizzy. Hearing this, Yun Jin looked at her timidly. Now, she already knew that Gong Yimo was a woman, but she was still very afraid of her. So when she saw her lying on her bed and eating without changing her clothes, she didn't dare to say a word. I'm just afraid that Yun will be taken advantage of. After all, when the emperor forced her that day, he said such threatening words. But how could she say such words? Gong Yimo comforted her. Don't worry. No matter how crazy the emperor is, he won't go so far. But you, have you thought it through? Thought it through? Yoon Jin frowned very unwillingly. Today, this woman said that she wanted her to leave the cold palace to regain favor. She resisted in her heart. When she thought of the fierce emperor, her body trembled. Looking at her appearance, she knew that she was unwilling. Gong Yimo rolled her eyes. If you are willing to listen to me, I guarantee that you will definitely become the emperor's favorite concubine. Think about it. Once you are favored, your son's situation will be much better. What she said was true. But when she thought of the way the women in the harem looked at her, she trembled. I can't do it. As she said this, she seemed to want to cry. But Gong Yimo's gaze forced her back. Really, a person in her 30s. Can't she be a little more mature and not cry all the time? On the other hand, Kim Yoon was really a little restless. It was clearly still early, but Imperial Father asked him to play chess with Lu Yi's prince first. And that prince's eyes were fixed on him, making him feel a little angry. But in front of the emperor, he couldn't just flick his sleeves and leave, so he could only endure it. The emperor saw this and pretended not to know. At this time, they were sitting in a pavilion by the lake. Light muslin floated in the air, and with beautiful women as their companions, they were having a lot of fun. Halfway through the game, Rucha finally became a little impatient. He pushed away the chess pieces and shouted that he didn't want to play anymore. He reached out and pulled a palace maid who was serving tea to sit on his lap. The palace maid cried out in alarm and her face turned red. But this foreign prince was an important guest. Even if she was afraid, she didn't dare to struggle. She could only look at the emperor with her beautiful eyes. After all, the women in the harem were all his. Chapter 178. Unfortunately, the emperor didn't even look at her. She was just a palace maid. If he wanted to play with her, so be it. This Lu Yi's Eagle King was as strong as a ferocious beast, just like the rumors said. Moreover, he had a big beard and eyes as big as copper bells. He looked very frightening. At this moment, his hands were extremely disobedient as they touched the woman in his arms. He used too much strength, causing the little palace maid to turn pale from the pain. She cried out softly. However, Rucha didn't care. He stared at Kim Yoon and chuckled. There are so many beauties here. Why don't your highness enjoy one? As he spoke, he stared at Kim Yoon's lower body with lustful eyes. His smile became even more vulgar. Jin Sheng saw this and snorted coldly. He was indeed the son of a slut. He knew how to seduce people. It was such a waste that he was born a man. Fortunately, there was a buyer who didn't abstain from meat and vegetables. Perhaps he could be sold for a good price. He ordered calmly, Yoon, leave first. Go and see how the preparations for the banquet are going. Tonight, we won't leave until we're drunk. Kim Yoon couldn't stay any longer. He quickly got up and left. As soon as he left, Rucha pulled a long face and pushed away the woman in his arms. His voice was as loud as a bell. What does your highness mean by this? Jin Sheng lay down and smiled coldly. She can't run away. Let's talk business first. Is the news you said earlier true? Although Rucha was a little dissatisfied, he was still in someone else's territory. His heart was itching, so he endured it. Do you think I would lie to you? The princess of Dai Yu State has a sharp weapon that can split open mountains and split open the earth. Didn't you see how anxious the emperor of Dai Yu State was? He almost forced her to death. However, there's reliable news that she's still alive. Now, whoever gets her first will have the right to rule the world. Jin Sheng didn't believe it. She was just a woman. What ability could she have? In his opinion, most women were smart and docile like the empress, or fragile and beautiful like Yoon Jin. They weren't the popular Chaoyang princess. He felt that the princess must be extremely ugly. Otherwise, why would no one praise her appearance when she appeared in public? Gong Yimo, she touched her ears and continued to persuade her you. Gong Yimo winked and smiled. How can there be no way? Let me tell you too. First, you can coax the emperor, assassinate him, and help your son become the emperor. You can be the Empress Dowager. Then, you'll be the most powerful woman in Yuheng. You can go wherever you want and do whatever you want. She glanced at Yoon Jin, whose eyes had widened in fear at her words. Yoon Jin pursed her lips. Forget it. Second, you can coax the emperor. Once you have power and influence, and your son has power and influence, you can fake your death and leave the palace. The words leave the palace made Yoon Jin's eyes light up. However, when she thought of the prerequisites, she couldn't help but feel discouraged. No, I can't be his opponent. He's so fierce and cruel. She looked very wronged when she said this. In short, she didn't want to do it. You can try. What are you afraid of with me around? Yoon Jin glanced at her. She sat there like a little daughter-in-law and didn't say anything. Gong Yimo was a little impatient. She sat up and asked very seriously. Can I ask why you're so against the emperor? Did he beat you until you're scared? How about this? As long as you listen to me, I promise he won't beat you in the future. When Yoon Jin heard this, she said shyly after a while. I think he's ugly. What? Gong Yimo thought she heard wrong and asked subconsciously. I said he's ugly. Her voice was louder this time, which made Gong Yimo's eyes widen. Oh my, is this still a young girl? She didn't say it. In ancient times, there were only a few emperors who were as handsome as Emperor Gongcheng. Most of them didn't have good looks, especially those who liked to grow beards. In Gong Yimo's opinion, Jin Sheng wasn't good-looking, but he was barely acceptable. She actually used such a reason to refuse to be favored. Gong Yimo was speechless. This was the first time she felt so stifled that she couldn't speak. Didn't those favored concubines in history admit that they were ugly when they met them? They didn't say anything when they married someone in their 60s or 70s. She actually had the nerve. If she didn't have the ability to change the situation, she should accept it, okay? If she didn't have the ability, how could she be so picky? Gong Yimo took a few bites of snacks to calm herself down. She needed to calm down. It was getting late. Gong Yimo looked at the time and thought the banquet should be over. Why hadn't Kim Yoon come back yet? Was she right? Yoon Jin kept waiting at the door, looking in from time to time for fear that she would miss something. After waiting for a long time, she couldn't help but ask Gong Yimo for help. Miss Shi Yoon hasn't come back for so long. I'm worried. Can you help me find him? Shi was Gong Yimo's alias. She rolled her eyes. If I'm not here, who are you going to ask for help from? Yoon Jin choked, then gritted her teeth and was about to kneel in front of her. Miss Shi. She knelt on the ground and begged. I know you're angry that I'm weak, but Yoon is innocent. His Majesty is biased against him. And His Majesty said, what else did he say? Yoon Jin couldn't bring herself to say it. Anyway, Miss Shi, please do him a favor and help him. Gong Yimo looked at the sky and said slowly, get up. Wait a moment. I'll go. Yoon Jin wanted to urge her, but she was asking for help. Besides, Gong Yimo scared her, so she didn't dare to ask. This disappointed Gong Yimo. When Kim Yoon woke up, he found himself on a luxurious bed. When he got up, he felt weak all over. Then, he found that he was naked. His expression changed from anger to disappointment to pain, and finally to panic. He thought of the wine that his father personally toasted him at the banquet. He was flattered, but he didn't expect it to be like this. He wanted to leave this place. He wanted to ask why. What was the reason? With this thought, he immediately sat up. This seemed to be Xingyun Palace, which was used to entertain important guests. It was also the most exquisite place in the entire palace. His father was really considerate. He wanted to laugh, but the bitterness and anger in his expression were so heartbreaking. From the way he treated his mother, it could be seen that Kim Yoon was a very sentimental person. He always had a glimmer of hope for his father. But Jin Sheng's action really chilled his heart. His chest hurt and his whole body trembled. Chapter 179. As soon as he got off the bed, Kim Yoon's legs went soft and he fell to the ground. In order to prevent him from escaping, those people really put in a lot of effort. What should he do now? His men were all waiting outside. How could he escape by himself? At this moment, The door creaked open and a tall figure walked in. Kim Yoon looked at him in disbelief, his eyes wide open. All of this was actually true. His father had actually given his own son to a man. Seeing Kim Yoon sitting on the ground with only the quilt covering his body, other than that, he was naked. That loose black hair, snow-white skin, and exquisite face, under the light, was simply too beautiful to be a mortal. Seeing this, Rucha's originally dizzy head suddenly quivered, revealing an anxious and burning gaze. "Your Highness, what is going on?" Kim Yoon endured the numbness in his scalp and tried to calm himself down. He raised his head and said with difficulty, "No matter whose slanderous words father listens to. I, in any case, am still the Prince of Yuheng, so you can't do this. Doing this is equivalent to trampling on the Yuheng kingdom. Why is father so stupid?" Who knew that when Rucha heard this, he laughed loudly. In a few steps, he was in front of Kim Yoon and looked down at him greedily. "You still don't know, but because of your noble status, in order to get you, I paid the price of 1,000 horses. An ordinary woman is only the price of a horse. Your father really sold you for a good price. No, this can't be true. How is this possible?" Without waiting for Kim Yoon to digest this, Rucha bent down and forcibly lifted his head. His eyes stared at him, revealing a wolf-like gaze. "You really are a peerless beauty. Your face serves you right to be pressed under my body. When I saw you just now, this thing, I couldn't control it." As he spoke, he straightened his body. That appearance was really vulgar to the extreme. "Let me go." Kim Yoon bit the tip of his tongue to sober himself up. He was powerless and couldn't resist, but he still stubbornly stared at him. 1,000 horses, I will return them to you. Yes, he would return them to him even if he lost his family's fortune, as long as he let him go. Rucha heard this and smiled evilly, looking at him from head to toe playfully. But what to do? No matter how many horses there are, they can't compare to a rouge horse like you. As he spoke, he lifted him up and threw him on the bed. Humiliation. The endless humiliation was like fire burning his nerves. He thought he had completely put his pride and dignity, but he didn't expect that God would give him a bloody blow and trample him to be trampled into the mud. Jin Yoon's face was flushed red, and his facial muscles were trembling. He couldn't believe that all of this wasn't true. How could he? How could he be on a disgusting man's bed? Lucha saw Jin Yoon struggling with all his might on the bed. Jin Yoon's taut muscles, flushed face, and lips that were about to bleed from biting too hard, all of these made his blood boil. He loved to rape and subdue disobedient people the most. Jin Sheng really gave him a big stunner. What a pity, he could only enjoy this stunner once before killing him. What a pity, Rucha thought as he slowly took off his clothes. Kim Yoon struggled to crawl to a corner and stared at Rucha with hatred. No. Even if he died, he would never submit to a man. When Rucha pressed down on him, Kim Yoon closed his eyes and wanted to bite his tongue to commit suicide. But he neglected one point: the tongue was very tough. With his current strength, he couldn't bite it off. He raised his head to look at the top of the bed and felt that he was really being pressed down by a disgusting man. That pair of beautiful eyes finally showed despair. He suddenly hated that he was born with such a face, hated that he was born in such a place. Why? He had always had hope in his heart and had always worked hard to live. Why did he have to suffer like this? Why? He was disgusted by this world. Suddenly, Rucha groaned and fell to the ground. Kim Yoon raised his head in surprise and saw Gong Yimo miraculously appear in front of him. She seemed a little embarrassed as she grinned. "I'm not too late, am I?" She had some injuries on her body, but at this moment, she, who was in a sorry state, was like a ray of light that shone in when he was being invaded by darkness. At the critical moment, she dispelled the darkness and saved his heart. In fact, many evil people would not become like this if someone was willing to help them when they were being twisted. And Gong Yimo was the one who helped Kim Yoon. Kim Yoon closed his eyes and laid on the bed. Although he didn't even have the strength to push Rucha away, he still revealed a smile. He was saved. Gong Yimo sat on the side of the bed, gasping for breath. She also didn't have any strength. Historically, all the guards who entered the imperial palace had to retreat to the periphery, but this Lu Yis Wangye had openly brought them in. Just now, she wanted to kill her way in without batting an eyelid, but it really took a lot of effort. Kim Yoon finally had some strength after lying down for a while. The first thing he did was to push the person on top of him away. Then he raised the jade pillow and prepared to smash him to death. The enmity of humiliation was irreconcilable, only his blood could wash away the sin, but Gong Yimo stopped him. Wait a minute, I still have use for this person. Who knew that Kim Yoon, who was always easy to talk to, would angrily stare at her. This person, I can't tolerate him for even a second. I want him to die immediately. Gong Yimo's hand tightly held onto his hand, not moving an inch. Her eyes were cold and firm. Is there any use? If you kill him, have you considered the consequences? Even if you have some connections to escape, what about your imperial mother? I'll say this first, I don't have the ability to bring a woman out of the palace with 10,000 imperial guard. But, you're just going to let it go like this? Kim Yoon seemed to be asking her in a disbelieving tone, but his eyes were red and his chest was heaving up and down. The hand holding the jade pillow was so tight that it was trembling. It was clear that his heart was filled with anger. He almost humiliated me. A warrior can be killed, but not humiliated. Even if I kill him 100 times, it won't be too much. Isn't it too much? If you want to sacrifice your life and your imperial mother's life for a scum, then go ahead. After saying that, Gong Yimo really let go of his hand in a fit of anger. But her last sentence was heard by Kim Yoon. But the great humiliation made him raise his hand and put it down again. The fierce light in his eyes did not fade. Gong Yimo said indifferently, you obviously can't bear the consequences, but you still want to act in a moment of anger. Do you think that this kind of person is a hot-blooded man? Gong Yimo sighed and touched her shoulder that was still bleeding, grimacing. Living in adversity is a very difficult thing. Since you've been enduring, why don't you continue to endure? Clench your teeth and endure. If you don't endure and fight for the final fruit, then what's the point of enduring in the past? Seeing Kim Yoon biting his lips tightly, Gong Yimo couldn't help but soften her tone and said word by word, you have to remember clearly that you didn't come to this world to suffer, but to break the suffering and obtain happiness. You may have been in pain, but as long as the heavens don't play you to death, you still have a chance. Isn't that right? Chapter 180. Her words caused Kim Yoon's hurried breathing to gradually calm down. His eyes also gradually calmed down. That's right, if he couldn't succeed, then what was the point of all this? What was the point of all his hard work and sacrifice? He put down the jade pillow and asked in an extremely cold voice. Then what do you want to do with him? Gong Yimo breathed a sigh of relief, revealing an expression of a child who could be taught. Just now, did he say anything to you? Time was of the essence, so Gong Yimo went straight to the point. Kim Yoon faintly sighed. Then he gritted his teeth and said, he said that I had been exchanged for 1,000 horses by that person. Right now, he wasn't even willing to call him imperial father. He only felt disgust towards that person. And his words made Gong Yimo ponder deeply. She coldly looked at the big man in disheveled clothes in front of her, revealing a trace of cold light. Everyone knew that Rucha was disliked by King Lu Yi because of some of his hobbies. However, this person had some ability and was very loyal, so King Lu Yi trusted him a lot. He only pretended to dislike him on the surface to confuse the public. Gong Yimo reached out and pulled the life tablet from his neck. This thing was worn by all the people with status in Lu Yi. Not only did it symbolize their status, it could also be used to order their subordinates. Therefore, it was also called a command tablet. Seeing the tablet was like seeing the person. She looked at the small words on the tablet and said to Kim Yoon, just now, I killed 4 people guarding outside. Moreover, they also revealed that Rucha had many people protecting him. They would take turns to change shifts. In a while, the people changing shifts might come. When they come and see the person on duty, they will definitely come over to ask. At that time, you will appear and use this command tablet to order them to do something. What is it? Kim Yoon didn't ask such a stupid question. He believed in Gong Yimo. Everything she did was reasonable. Gong Yimo smiled, don't blame me. You're the one that their prince has taken a fancy to. He can't go first, so you're the only one who can. As for what message to pass, tell them to look for the Emperor of Yuheng and tell him that the horse deal is invalid. Remember, you can only tell Jin Sheng. If he can't figure it out, he will definitely be furious and come looking for trouble with Prince Lu Yi. At that time, we will be able to catch the tail of the horse. Kim Yoon nodded and accepted the token. At this moment, he felt a little cold in hindsight. Because of his emotions, he didn't notice it. Winter in Yuheng was even colder than in Daiyu State. They didn't have an earth dragon here, so it would be strange if he didn't feel cold when he was naked. However, Gong Yimo didn't seem to notice that he wasn't wearing any clothes. She pricked up her ears and waited for the guards to change shifts. At the same time, she sized up the man lying on the bed with a sneaky look in her eyes. 1,000 horses, this wasn't a small number. One must know that in ancient times, millions of soldiers were bragged a lot. There wasn't a real number at all. Moreover, Lu Yi had a lot of precious horses, but he was very strict about it. Therefore, this kind of deal couldn't go through Prince Lu Yi. She didn't know what tricks Prince Lu Yi wanted to play this time. Thinking of that domineering and ambitious man, Gong Yimo shook her head. However, she saw Kim Yoon looking at her blankly, as if he didn't know what to say. What's wrong? Kim Yoon tugged at the blanket. He didn't understand why a 20-year-old man like him, who often mingled in brothels, would feel so uncomfortable in front of a young girl. The moment her eyes fell on him, he felt as if he was scalded. I don't have any clothes here. How will I go out later? Gong Yimo said as if it was a matter of course, only with clothes will people be suspicious, okay? Later, you will wear this when you go out. As she said this, she pulled out the silk blanket from the bed and threw it on him. But looking at it, she felt that it was a bit inappropriate. When he went out later, Rucha's subordinates would see that there wasn't a single trace on him. It really didn't look like he had been pampered by Prince Rucha. This prince was very cruel. How would he know how to have tender feelings for the fairer sex? She took out a box of matte eyeshadow and some disguise tools from her space. Seeing her approaching with something, Kim Yoon hugged the silk blanket and leaned back. What are you doing? His beautiful eyes opened wide. Although he was 20 years old, because he had been practicing dance since he was young, he looked like a 16-year-old youth. His body was in the best period of being half soft and half hard, so tender that it was like water. Gong Yimo smiled. Naturally, I'm going to put on makeup for you. You don't want me to personally make a few bloody marks on your body, right? As she said this, she pounced on him and used a small brush to carefully draw on his body. Her eyes didn't have the slightest bit of desire, only clarity. This made Kim Yoon feel relieved, but also a little disappointed. His face was unforgettable for anyone who saw it, no matter if it was a man or a woman. But Gong Yimo didn't have any feelings at all. Kim Yoon thought that it was probably because she was still young and didn't understand it. At this time, Gong Yimo was immersed in drawing on his chest. That serious look was like she was treating a piece of art. Fortunately, she had a lot of tools in her hands, so she wasn't afraid of anything. But her actions made Kim Yoon suffer. That small brush was like a feather, gently teasing his body. Unfortunately, he was someone who was very ticklish. But seeing how serious Gong Yimo was, he didn't dare to move and could only bear with it. But Gong Yimo accidentally touched his sensitive spot. He couldn't help but let out a soft groan and gasped. This soft groan seemed to have ignited something. It made the two of them stop and stare at each other. Kim Yoon only felt his face burning. The one who groaned just now wasn't him, not him, not him. Gong Yimo slowly opened her mouth after a while. If you want to scream, go ahead. As she said this, she took the small brush and continued to apply. She said in a serious tone, after all, when this guy is pampering someone, it's definitely not quiet. As she said this, she even nodded seriously. Go ahead and scream. Someone will be here soon. It's not good to be so quiet. How could he possibly scream? Kim Yoon wanted to find a hole to hide in. It was just an act, there was no need to go through so much. But Gong Yimo insisted, no, you must scream. Scream more intensely. Kim Yoon only felt that his mouth was glued to everything. If he didn't scream, He couldn't even make a sound. But reality gave him a cruel slap. Gong Yimo saw that he didn't say anything and pinched his chest hard. This stimulation came fiercely and fiercely, causing Kim Yoon to scream. His voice was pleasant to the ear, and this scream made Gong Yimo tremble all over. This was probably the legendary kind of scream that made one's soul leave their body, right? She touched her nose and continued to paint. Kim Yoon's face was originally red, and now even his body was red. But seeing how calm Gong Yimo was, he was a little unconvinced. Wasn't it just a few screams? He had heard many of them in the brothel. Could it be that he wasn't afraid of a little girl? As he thought about this, he didn't care about his bottom line anymore and started to scream in a low voice. The red tent seemed to heat up in an instant. Under Kim Yoon's sometimes loud and sometimes low moans, Gong Yimo almost couldn't hold the small brush in her hand. She wiped her sweat. At this moment, Kim Yoon was lying on the bed. His upper body had turned a light pink. His exquisite face, paired with his black hair, had an indescribable purity and seductiveness. She was indeed the world's #1 beauty. When her beauty reached a certain level, it didn't differentiate between gender. Gong Yimo drew one ambiguous mark after another on his body. Under the light, it seemed like it was real, and she was the one doing it. The temperature in the bed rose again. She really wanted to kill him. Chapter 181. After a while, her ears twitched and she hurriedly put everything away. She gave Kim Yoon a look. Someone is here. That person hesitated at the door for a moment before asking, "Is His Highness well?" At this moment, the door opened and Kim Yoon's expressionless face was indeed there. He was wearing a thin layer of silk and there were traces on his body that couldn't be covered. His eyes were empty as if he had already resigned himself to his fate. "His Highness is asleep and wants me to give this to you. He wants you to do something." That person was stunned and took the token, asking, "Where is the person who was on duty?" Kim Yoon sneered, "I've sent him out. Why does His Highness need your permission to do anything?" Seeing that person's hesitation, Kim Yoon impatiently turned to the side. "If you don't believe me, you can go and ask him yourself." As he spoke, he tiredly retreated to the side and leaned against the door frame. This subordinate doesn't dare. When that person heard him say this, he believed most of it and his attitude became more honest. What does His Highness want this subordinate to do? Kim Yoon didn't even look at him as he said faintly, "It's nothing much. He just wants you to find my good imperial father and tell him that the horse deal is invalid." That person's coarse face showed some hesitation. He thought to himself, this was clearly something that had been discussed. Why did he change his mind just like that? Thinking about it, he glanced at Kim Yoon. Perhaps His Highness's new favorite said something, so His Highness flew into a rage for a woman? Kim Yoon looked at him coldly. "Is there a problem?" "No. This subordinate will do it right away. Remember, this matter can only be told to my imperial father." Yes. Golden Hall Palace. When Jin Sheng was dug out of his tender home, he was very dissatisfied. But when he heard that it was Rucha's people, he still received them. But when he heard what they said, he immediately flew into a rage. "What is the meaning of Your Highness? We have already agreed on the terms. Why did he change his mind just like that?" For the sake of a pleasant cooperation, he had even sent his own son to his bed. Did he want to go back on his word after eating it? After saying that, he couldn't be bothered to argue with a servant, and angrily went to Cloud Palace. At this time, Kim Yoon had already put on his clothes. Gong Yimo pulled down the curtains so that outsiders could not see the situation inside. At least when Jin Sheng came in, he only saw the two figures behind the curtain. He came in alone and said angrily, "What do you mean?" Unexpectedly, the one who answered him was actually Kim Yoon. He walked out of the curtain step by step and looked at Jin Sheng. His eyes were blazing with fire. He smiled coldly. "Imperial father, it's just the literal meaning. Rucha thinks that it's too much of a loss to trade with horses, so he wants to exchange some chips with you." Kim Yoon's appearance made Jin Sheng retreat with a guilty conscience. Moreover, Kim Yoon's current appearance was really frightening. His eyes were filled with anger and hatred. It was as if he was an evil spirit that had crawled out from hell. He was here to take his life. Seeing the ambiguous marks on his bare chest, Jin Sheng quickly turned his head away, not daring to look. He only said to the person on the bed, "Exchange chips." Impossible. It can only be horses, and it has to be war horses. Otherwise, there's nothing to talk about. Kim Yoon sneered, "So Imperial Father really exchanged me for horses? You really have no shame." His words were like a slap to Jin Sheng's face. Impudent. He flew into a rage and said viciously, "What do you know? It's your honor to be able to contribute to the country. Isn't it just sleeping with a man? So what? You're a bastard." Jin Sheng's words deeply hurt Kim Yoon. It was as if a knife had sliced his chest into pieces. At this moment, he heard Rucha's voice from the bed's curtains. "Yoon, don't be rude." This voice gave Kim Yoon a fright. He stood there for a long time, unable to regain his senses. This is Gong Yimo's voice. From the curtains, Gong Yimo continued, "As for your Majesty Yuheng, this exchange, no matter how this prince thinks about it, this prince feels that this is a loss. War horses are hard to come by. Since you're here, why don't we continue to discuss the issue of quantity? Pay." Her words made Jin Sheng so angry that his face turned green. He thought that he was already very shameless, but he didn't expect the other party to be even more shameless. She raised the price on the spot, causing him to lose a peerless son for nothing. So in his extreme anger, he couldn't care about anything else and directly said, "Do you think we're afraid of you? If you want to go back on your words, sure, we'll just break up. It's just 10,000 horses, we don't want it." Kim Yoon was shocked. "Isn't it 1,000 horses?" When Jin Sheng heard this, he looked at him sympathetically. "Silly son, 1,000 horses is just a down payment. Without 10,000 horses, you want to borrow Yuheng's road to attack Daiyu State? Dream on. We're still thinking that it's too little, and you still want to bargain?" His words silenced the room. After a while, Gong Yimo said, "Yoon, get out." At this time, Jin Yoon was extremely shocked. He actually obediently walked out. At this moment, Jin Sheng finally realized that something was wrong. He rushed to the bed and pulled open the curtains, but all he saw was darkness and he lost consciousness. Kim Yoon had just walked to the door when he saw him collapse. He couldn't regain his senses for a long time. Make way for Lu Yi. Was Jin Sheng crazy? How dare he agree to such a deal? If he went back on his words at the last minute, it would be tantamount to inviting a wolf into the house, and the entire Yuheng state would suffer. While he was still in shock, Gong Yimo was dragging Jin Sheng onto the bed. He couldn't help but ask in a daze, "Aren't you worried? Lu Yi wants to attack Daiyu State." Gong Yimo reached out to take off Jin Sheng's clothes. Fortunately, Jin Sheng came in alone, or else they would have alerted the enemy. When she heard Kim Yoon's words, she rolled her eyes. King Lu Yi has been wanting to invade the Central Plains for a long time. What's there to be surprised about? Her words made Kim Yoon speechless, and his hands clenched into fist. When he thought about how Yuheng would be caught in the flames of war because of Jin Sheng's mistake, he gritted his teeth and said, "This can't be done. If it succeeds, Yuheng will be in danger." Gong Yimo smiled. "Jin Sheng isn't that stupid. Don't you still have 10,000 horses? This is a considerable fighting force. If Lu Yi really wants to go back on his words during the passage, with the advantage of location and these war horses, Yuheng will be able to resist for a while. Moreover, he can ask Daiyu State for help the moment Lu Yi goes back on his words. If the lips are gone, the teeth will be cold. Daiyu State will definitely help, so, he's not stupid. This deal isn't a loss. If Lu Yi successfully ambushed Daiyu State, and Daiyu State was caught off guard, Yuheng would definitely switch sides with Lu Yi. When the time came, two countries would fight against one country. If they succeeded, they would reap even more benefit. Such a clever idea didn't seem like something Jin Sheng could come up with. Kim Yoon also laughed coldly. Asking a tiger for its skin? Why don't you see if he has the brains and appetite to do so? After he finished speaking, he realized that Gong Yimo was stripping the emperor of his clothes. He quickly walked over. "What are you doing?" Gong Yimo smiled mischievously. "You're right. I don't believe that this is Jin Sheng's idea either. Moreover, didn't you say that you don't want this to succeed? So, I'm sabotaging it. A faint light flashed in her eyes. This is really fun. I wonder if the two people behind Yu Heng's emperor being raped by Lu Yi's prince will still be able to sit still. Chapter 182. As she spoke, she took out a bottle from her hand and smiled evilly. What a strong drug. Ever since Gong Dai was drugged with this drug, she was very curious, so she kept it on her. She didn't expect that it would really come in handy. She stuffed the drug into both of their mouths. After stuffing one pill, she was afraid that it wasn't enough, so she stuffed another one. She even said, "Are you satisfied? These two shameless people are going to torture each other later." Kim Yoon was speechless at her words. This was clearly a very urgent and serious matter to him, but she was not in a hurry, as if she was just playing around. Later, pretend to be angry and run out. I think it will take a while for the drug to take effect, so if you go out now, it'll be equivalent to an alibi. Tomorrow, if the emperor wants to punish you, you can say that you came out under Rucha's orders and didn't know what happened to them later. What about you? Kim Yoon was a little worried. This was too big of a game. He felt uneasy, but he couldn't find any reason to refute. Gong Yimo looked coldly at the people on the bed and smiled faintly. I'll sacrifice a little and wait for them to take effect before I leave. This is to ensure that nothing goes wrong. Kim Yoon was still worried. Moreover, how could a little girl like Gong Yimo see such a scene? However, Gong Yimo looked at him with a gaze that didn't allow him to refuse. That calmness that seemed to have everything under control didn't allow him to question her. Thus, Kim Yoon had no choice but to leave. After Kim Yoon left, Gong Yimo let out a long sigh of relief. She rubbed her chin and calculated what the best thing to do was. She only let Rucha rape Jin Sheng. Hey. Gong Yimo laughed. This was far from enough. She wanted these two people to never have the chance to work together. The drug gradually took effect. Gong Yimo looked at their faces slowly turning red and became unbearable. She smiled faintly and placed a dagger under the pillow. Then, she jumped onto the beam and hid herself perfectly. Jin Sheng only felt a fire burning in his body. Before he could understand what was happening, Rucha had already pounced on him. The man's body gave him a shock. How dare you? Get out of my way, get out of my way. How could Rucha let him off? He thought that he was hugging Kim Yoon, and he loudly laughed as he said, "Baby, don't resist. The moment I saw you, I wanted you." Jin Sheng still wanted to say something, but his mouth was blocked by the other party. He felt disgusted, but more importantly, the strange pleasure in his body made him gradually give up resisting. The night was still young. Gong Yimo squinted her eyes, feeling a little sleepy. At this moment, these two people were the most important, so she endured the noise and stayed. In a daze, she was shocked by Jin Sheng's scream. She looked down. It was simply an eyesore. This Rucha really knew how to torture people. Because it was a little disgusting, Gong Yimo simply sealed her 5 senses and closed her eyes to rest. But she didn't expect that something would happen at this late hour. Because the palace doors were locked and Kim Yoon was feeling muddle-headed, he went to the cold palace. He originally wanted to report to his mother that he was safe and sound, but he didn't expect to hear a woman's scream coming from the cold palace. This voice was, "Mother." Kim Yoon was shocked. He angrily ran in, only to see his mother being pressed down on the bed by 2 men. That scene made his blood flow backward. Without thinking, he rushed up to tear them apart. Yoon Jin dodged a bullet and quickly hugged her clothes to the foot of the bed. Kim Yoon wanted to hit again, but the other party's guards reacted and grabbed his hands and feet. His entire face was flushed with anger as he stared at the 2 people in front of him, wishing he could tear off a piece of flesh. "Jinju, are you crazy? Are you crazy?" he screamed at the top of his lungs. That's right, the 2 people who came to the cold palace in the middle of the night, one was the eldest prince, Jinju, and the other was the 4th prince, Jinming. At this time, they were calmly staring at Kim Yoon, not putting him in their eyes at all. "Oh, who was I? So it's the 2nd prince who was taken by a man. Bah. I almost forgot, How can such a slut be worthy of a prince? He's just like his slut mother, used to seducing people. As he spoke, Jinju glanced at Yoon Jin on the bed. At this time, she seemed to be scared silly. She was motionless and hugging herself tightly, unable to hear anything. Her appearance also frightened Kim Yoon. He shouted loudly for his mother, but she was still unmoved, as if she had lost her soul. Why was it like this? What was going on? At night, he was drugged by his own father and sent to a man's bed. Late at night, his beastly brothers actually wanted to lay their hands on his mother. The imperial family's corruption was so disgusting. What hope did he have? What hope did he have? At this time, Jin Ming also came up and shamelessly asked, "How is it, second brother? Is the taste of this man good?" As he spoke, he laughed loudly, as if he was extremely happy to see Kim Yoon in so much pain that he wished he was dead. "I'm going to kill you all," Kim Yoon said in a low voice. "What?" Jin Ming didn't hear clearly and came over to listen with a smile, but Kim Yoon bit his ear tightly. "Ah!" He screamed and repeatedly called for people to pull him away, but when the guards who pulled Kim Yoon dragged Kim Yoon back, Jin Ming screamed even more miserably. Jin Ju's eyes flashed fiercely as he punched and kicked Kim Yoon. "Let go, bastard! Let go of me!" The sound of flesh being hit and Jin Ming's screams made people's scalp tingle, but Kim Yoon didn't seem to feel the pain. He stared at Jin Ju and bit his ear tightly, as if he wanted to bite it off. Jin Ju's eyes flashed fiercely. A prince who had already been sent out by his father to warm the bed dares to rebel? He took out a dagger and stabbed towards Kim Yoon's face. Suddenly, Yoon Jin woke up from her dream. She, who had always been cowardly and only knew how to endure, screamed and rushed over. "You are not allowed to hurt my son." As she spoke, she ruthlessly smashed the jade pillow on Jin Ju's head, causing blood to flow out. At this time, Kim Yoon finally let go of Jin Ming's ear. He covered his ear and sat on the ground screaming again and again. It was actually bitten in half by Kim Yoon. Kim Yoon cracked open his bloody teeth and laughed. "Crazy. All of you are crazy." In any case, this world was dirty and disgusting. A sober person would not be able to survive. The scene was in chaos. Yoon Jin rushed over and wiped the blood on her son's face. The tears in her eyes were like a broken dam. Yoon. Hateful. Jin Ju looked at his brother on the ground and fiercely pushed Yoon Jin away. He grabbed Kim Yoon's collar. He was shorter than Kim Yoon, so he looked up at Kim Yoon whose hands and feet were caught and grinned. "You dare to rebel in my hands? My good brother, you really don't understand your brother's means." As he spoke, he let go of him and picked up the cloud brocade on the ground. He held the dagger on Yoon Jin's neck with one hand and pinched her chin with the other to prevent her from biting her tongue to commit suicide. Then, he called the guards to release Kim Yoon. "Look carefully, you see how I disfigure this slut's face." Chapter 183. Yoon Jin looked at Kim Yoon with tears in her eyes. The meaning in her eyes was that she hoped her son would not care about her. "Isn't it just a face? This face has already brought her too much trouble." Kim Yoon looked at his mother and then looked at Jin Ju. His eyes seemed to bleed. He smiled bitterly. "Just say it. What do you want me to do for you to let my mother go?" At this time, there was still blood in his mouth. His voice was very calm, but his heart was filled with grief and indignation. His eyes were sometimes crazy and sometimes desperate. His whole person was in the middle of these two emotional storms. He was being pulled, but no matter which side it was a hell of eternal damnation. Seeing Kim Yoon being so obedient, Jin Ju laughed proudly. "You're crazy. Bite me. I'll let you be like a dog. Kneel down." Kim Yoon obeyed and knelt down. At this time, even if he was in a sorry state, it did not affect his beauty. Jin Ju was very jealous because he looked very mediocre. Therefore, he grinned and threw the dagger in his hand at Kim Yoon's feet. "Cheap bastard, pick it up for me." Kim Yoon's eyes flashed with a bloodthirsty light. His chest felt like it was going to split open. He wanted to explode. But when he saw his mother who was alone and helpless, he finally bowed his head and picked up the dagger, holding it tightly in his hand. Jin Ju greedily looked at his face, but more than that, he had an impulse to tear and destroy. He slowly smiled. Now, I want you to scratch your own face. How about this? If you scratch it hard enough, deep enough, I'll let your mother go. Otherwise. He looked at Yoon Jin's tear-stained face with lust. Ignoring her resentful eyes, he sneered. Otherwise, I've been thirsty for Yoon Jin's wife for a long time. It's so late, I'm afraid no one will stop me. Kim Yoon suddenly looked up at him. His eyes were deep and cold, as if he came from the abyss of purgatory. He wanted to desperately stab the dagger into the other's heart and tear everything in front of him apart. But he couldn't. He had to endure again. He was once again forced to the edge of the cliff by despair, with nowhere to retreat. In these few short hours, he had been drugged, almost humiliated, and his mother had almost been violated. Now, he had to kneel on the ground and wag his tail to beg for mercy. He sneered. Was there really any hope left in this world? Why was it that no matter how hard he tried, he could only be trampled on? Why was it that when he was full of hope, all that came was despair? He raised his hand and looked at the dagger's sharpness. The coldness of the dagger seemed to come from the depths of hell. Perhaps humans were born into this world to suffer. However, God gave you something called hope in order to let you struggle on your deathbed, everything. It was just a dream. Stab. Jin-ju suddenly roared. Kim Yoon's eyes were filled with despair. If it wasn't for his face, he wouldn't have been fancied by a man. It doesn't matter if it's scratched or gone. The dagger stabbed down forcefully. He used a lot of strength. He hoped that Jin-ju would let go of his mother for the sake of his obedience. But at the same time, the window cracked open and a figure rushed in. Because of the urgency of the situation, she only had time to hold the dagger's edge. Who is it? Ignoring Jin-ju's panic, Gong Yimo looked at Kim Yoon's wide-open eyes. She was greatly relieved. Fortunately, this time, I made it. Who are you? Jin-ju retreated and shouted, Someone come, are you all dead? Quickly catch her. The dagger was tightly embedded in Gong Yimo's palm, but Kim Yoon's breathing became cautious. He hurriedly loosened his grip, but his hand was still stained with blood. The successive shocks had left him completely dumbfounded. He opened his mouth, but he couldn't say a single word. Gong Yimo threw away the dagger. That bloody palm made his heart ache. He subconsciously held her hand, and then gently, he hugged it tightly in his arms. The guards approached. Gong Yimo only raised her head, but those people seemed to be frightened and hesitated. Taking advantage of this, Gong Yimo smiled at Jin-ju. Your Highness, you are still here. Do you know that something big happened to His Majesty? As expected, Jin-ju was taken away by her words. What? He wanted to see what she had to say. It wouldn't be too late to take her down. Gong Yimo sighed. Just now when I came over from Xingyun Palace, I heard Eagle King Lu Yi's roar and His Majesty's screams. Then, His Majesty suddenly went silent. I'm afraid. Before she could finish, Jin-ju hurriedly walked out. He wasn't thinking about saving his father, but if his father died, he could inherit the throne. It was this idiot who abandoned his injured younger brother and took away all his guards. Regardless of whether Jin Ming was still on the other side of the bed, he was crying out in a low and pitiful voice. At this time, his face was pale. Jin-ju's first reaction was not to call a doctor for him, but to vent his anger on Jin Yoon. Thinking about it, it wasn't a glorious thing for them to be in the cold palace. Gong Yimo said to the remaining guards of Jin Ming, Why are you still standing there? He is in so much pain that he is delirious. If something happens to him, are you waiting to lose your heads? The guards woke up from their daze. As for finding trouble with Kim Yoon or taking down Gong Yimo, sorry, they didn't think about it at all. Didn't they see that she solved the deadlock with just a few words? Not only did she save the second prince, she didn't even make a move. Moreover, her aura was shocking. One look and they could tell that she was a powerful person. Just a few small fries like them should forget about it. Gong Yimo sighed. At this moment, Yoon Jin woke up from her daze and rushed over with a scream. She trembled as she touched her son's face and said with tears in her eyes, Are you okay? Mother is useless. Mother is sorry. If it was any other time, Kim Yoon would definitely comfort her. But now, he was kneeling on the ground and holding Gong Yimo's hand, causing Gong Yimo to squat and talk. She hissed and glared at Kim Yoon, who seemed to have lost his soul. She said angrily, "If you don't let go, my hand will be crippled. If it leaves a scar, I won't be able to get married." As soon as she spoke, Kim Yoon raised his head and looked at her deeply. His face was still stained with blood, but his eyes were bright. His mouth moved, wanting to say, "If you can't get married, I will marry you." But thinking about it, he was a useless person. What right did he have to say such words to her now? She had saved him many times. He sighed and let go of Gong Yimou's hand. Seeing her take out a bottle of medicine, he quickly took it and helped her wipe it. He cleaned the wound so gently, as if he was holding a rare treasure. Throughout the whole process, he was kneeling. Chapter 184. Yoon Jin stopped crying and hurriedly went to fetch some water to help. Only the two of them were left in the room, along with the mess on the floor. Seeing him like this, Gong Yimou knew that he had suffered quite a blow. However, she wasn't good at comforting people, so she pretended to exaggerate. "You don't know. I was doing fine at Xingyun Palace, but I kept feeling uneasy. I suddenly remembered that you wouldn't be able to leave the palace so late at night, so you must be here. As expected, luckily I made it in time." She glanced at Kim Yoon, who didn't react at all and was only busy applying medicine. She paused, then grinned and said, "It's all thanks to my brilliant sixth sense. Otherwise, if your face was ruined, it would be a loss to the 4 countries. Kim Yoon finally looked up at her and asked softly, "Doesn't it hurt?" Gong Yimou was stunned by his question. Kim Yoon lowered his eyes again to look at the shocking wound on her palm, his voice even softer. "Doesn't it hurt here?" Hearing that, Gong Yimou suddenly felt a little embarrassed. "Of course it hurts. How can it not hurt?" Kim Yoon laughed. "Since it hurts, why are you comforting me instead?" Gong Yimou answered without thinking. "You were wronged outside, and when you came back, your mother cried when she heard it. Aren't you comforting her instead?" Gong Yimou didn't think too much about it, but Kim Yoon's heart was in turmoil. It was different from the anger from before. This time, it was a different kind of emotion. His eyelashes couldn't help but flutter as he lowered his eyes, and said in a seemingly unconcerned tone, "If you feel pain in the future, you can tell me too." Gong Yimou smiled. She was too lazy to squat, so she sat back on the ground. Her hand was carefully taken care of, and her legs even shook in satisfaction. "It's fine. It's just a small injury." She didn't care at all. Minor injuries? Kim Yoon didn't dare to agree. His mother would feel wronged for a long time when her fingers were pricked by needles. She thought that it was a bad sign and felt sad. However, she had 2 big wounds on her hand and said that it was a small injury. It was so deep. It could be seen how anxious she was at that time and how tightly she held on to it. For the first time in his life, Jin Yoon felt the feeling of being protected. "This is indeed a small injury," Gong Yimou said in a light tone. In her previous life, she had suffered too many injuries, so she was actually very afraid of getting hurt and pain. However, when she was really injured, she was not afraid anymore. Only when Gong Dai was around would she pretentiously snort a few times. Seeing that Kim Yoon didn't answer and looked a little sad, she couldn't help but use her good hand to touch his hair. The #1 beauty under the heavens. Even his hair was beautiful. It was silky and smooth to the touch, and his gentle appearance made one's heart ache. "You don't have to deny yourself and life for these scum. You're much better than them." Kim Yoon's hand that was applying medicine paused. "You think that I'm better than them?" He smiled bitterly. "Perhaps only you would think so." He had no power, no strength. He only had a face. He was a complete weakling. However, Gong Yimou shook her head. "You underestimate yourself too much. When you're in adversity, you don't give up hope. When everyone is ostracizing you, you can still use your clever mind to find a way to make money and improve your life. Moreover, you will do your best to help a group of truly weak people." Gong Yimou shook her head and smiled. A person who has the ability to help others, who works hard in adversity, who doesn't give up hope, who is filial and grateful, definitely can't be weak. Kim Yoon couldn't help but look into her eyes. A person's eyes would never lie. However, He only saw the smile in her eyes and absolute sincerity. She wanted to tell him that hope wasn't a lie from God, but something worth believing in. Therefore, she said, "You're a sincere and kind person. In my opinion, you're better than everyone in Yuheng." Kim Yoon couldn't help but smile. This smile drove away all the haze, and it was so beautiful that it could shine under the light. His eyes sparkled and were filled with hope again. His smile was so beautiful that Gong Yimo couldn't help but stare at him in a daze. "Actually, the reason why I thought of becoming a singer was because of you." Gong Yimo pointed at her own nose in hindsight. "Because of me?" "Yes." He lowered his head, leaving an extremely beautiful arc. "Although I thought of many ways to earn money back then, I couldn't make ends meet. The palace was like a bottomless pit. Later, I heard about your deeds." He smiled, "A woman who could take care of her younger brother and turn him around in the cold palace, creating such a feat. I suddenly wanted to see how you, who was in the same situation as me, did it. However, I had to earn money and couldn't leave. In the end, I came up with the idea of becoming a singer and traveling around the world." Gong Yimo opened her mouth and couldn't speak for a long time. No wonder she had never heard of the world's #1 beauty in her previous life. It was because of her that Kim Yoon had a completely different life in this life. Gong Yimo suddenly felt full of confidence. Fate could be changed. Therefore, while she could save the tragedy, she could also fulfill her dreams. She firmly believed. It was late and warm here. However, far away in Dayu State, the Marquis residence was brightly lit at night, with people coming in and out from time to time. Eldest Miss was about to get married, but the Marquis' mother fell ill. If she really died, Eldest Miss would have to mourn for 3 years. How could the Crown Prince wait for 3 years? Su Miaolan anxiously looked at the doctor who was walking around in circles in the room. It was late at night, but she didn't feel sleepy at all. How could she fall ill just like that? She secretly gritted her teeth, but in her heart, she hated the doctor for causing her trouble. She only needed 5 days. In another 5 days, she would marry the Crown Prince. She had thought it through. When the doctors came out, she would make them think of all ways to drag it out for 5 days. While she was thinking about how to persuade her father to use the tiger and wolf medicine, she didn't expect a cry to come from the room. Then, an old mema sorrowfully said, "The old lady died." When this voice reached Su Miaolan's ears, it was like a sudden clap of thunder. She only felt that the world was spinning, and she almost fainted. However, she was quickly supported by her mother who had been standing beside her. "Don't panic," the Marquis' wife, Madame Zhong, whispered. Su Miaolan wiped away her tears. "What should I do, mother? How could she die? How could she?" Madame Zhong hurriedly covered her mouth. Seeing that no one was paying attention, she lowered her voice and whispered in her ear. "No matter what you're thinking now, cry for me. You can't complain." Su Miaolan was already sad, and her mother's words made her even more sorrowful. She didn't die earlier or later, she really died at the right time. Her beautiful eyes revealed a bit of resentment, and she cried in a low voice, as if she was really sad. However, in her heart, she was brewing a sinister plan. She didn't care. So what if she died? The position of the Crown Prince's wife could only be hers. Chapter 185. With such a huge commotion in the Marquis' residence, many people were unable to sleep. The news of the old lady's death quickly spread to many people's residences. Chi Mana's lights were still on, and Gong Dai was still awake. At this moment, he was furiously writing on the table. Countless ideas and ideas poured out like water. These ideas were given to him by Gong Yimo, and he used them all with ease. Moreover, he created the value that they should have. "But royal sister, where are you?" Just as Gong Dai was about to send the letter to the store manager, he received 2 pieces of news. The first was about the Marquis' residence. He raised his eyebrows slightly, looked in the direction of the Eastern Palace, and smiled faintly. His good brother, who was known for his benevolence, had something to do with this matter. But in any case, it had nothing to do with him. It didn't matter if Su Miaolan couldn't marry the Crown Prince. After all, the Empress was still alive. Therefore, he threw this matter aside and looked at the second piece of news. There was only one sentence on the second piece of paper. Gong Yimo is suspected to have appeared at the border of Yuheng. He happily read it several times, repeatedly confirming it. Then, he clenched the letter in his hand. His chest rose and fell slightly, and his pair of black jade eyes burst out with light. Royal sister. He finally had news of her. The next day, it snowed heavily in Yuheng, but no matter how cold the snow was, it couldn't compare to the coldness of one's heart. Early in the morning, corpses were continuously dragged out of the Cloud Palace, leaving a trail of blood on the ground. On the dazzling white, there was a shocking red. Only Jin Sheng's roars could be heard in the entire hall. He seemed to have gone crazy, and his eyes were scarlet red. Below, the eldest prince, Jin Ju, was beaten to the point of dying. His nose was bruised and his face was swollen, and he couldn't speak. He deserved to be unlucky. Originally, it was late at night, and the Cloud Palace was filled with screams. No one dared to go and look. When it finally calmed down, the first prince rushed over. After asking about the situation, he rushed in under the guise of escorting the emperor. The ugly side of the two men was exposed to the world. His scream also woke up Jin Sheng, who was deep in thought. When he realized that he was under a man, his brain was immediately burned by anger. Coincidentally, his hand touched a hard object. When he realized that it was a dagger, he stabbed it without thinking. Poor Rucha was still enjoying himself, but his lower body was in severe pain. He had actually been crippled by Jin Sheng with a single slash. His screams attracted the attention of the guards around him. When they saw the miserable state of their prince, how could they bear it? They quickly fought with the emperor's men. Jin Sheng's face was even more distorted. He struggled to prop up his torn body, and resentfully looked at the culprit, Jin Ju. He wished he could tear him to pieces. It's over, it's all over. He, an emperor, was actually. If he couldn't kill all of them, how could he still have the face to live in this world? Although Rucha had brought many people, this was Yuheng's palace after all. His men were gradually killed. Jin Sheng originally wanted to kill Rucha and the first prince together, but an Avcilla arrived in time and saved the two. Now, Rucha had been sent for treatment, and Jin Ju was inevitably beaten up. This night could be said to be chaotic. When an Avcilla walked into the main hall, Jin Sheng's throat was hoarse from screaming. He sat on the dragon throne and panted violently, thinking, who hasn't been killed yet? So when he saw an Avcilla, who he had always relied on, his eyes were filled with murderous intent. An Avcilla's face stiffened under his gaze, but he still respectfully bowed. His tone was earnest as he said, "Your Majesty, please calm down. Don't fall into that evil person's trap." Jin Sheng sneered, but because it touched on his sore spot, his face became ferocious. "Evil person?" He looked at an Avcilla unkindly. "The one who wanted us to cooperate with Lu Yi was you. The one who wanted us to give our son to him was also you. Now, tell me, who is this evil person?" An Avcilla broke out in a cold sweat at his word. He knelt down with a thump. "Your Majesty, I'm innocent. Even if you lend this subject more courage, this subject still wouldn't dare to attack you." His eyes flashed with resentment, and he suddenly said, "In this subject's opinion, this matter is the second prince's doing. Otherwise, why would it be Your Majesty instead of him?" Jin Sheng narrowed his eyes. "You mean, that little bastard harmed us?" Thinking of this, he flew into a rage. "Guards! Go capture that little bastard and put him to death by 1,000 cut." Hold on. An Avcilla was delighted. He hurriedly got up and moved forward. "Now that Rucha is so badly injured, if we don't give Lu Yi an explanation, I'm afraid there will be trouble. How about, we push all the blame onto Kim Yoon? Let's say that Rucha saw his beauty and wanted to take it by force. In the end, he was injured by Kim Yoon, so let's make him the scapegoat. What do you think?" Before Jin Sheng could speak, there was a sudden commotion at the door. Kim Yoon pushed the guards aside and strode in. He looked at Jin Sheng and said, "Imperial father, are you still going to be deceived by him? Why don't you think that he's the one who schemed against you? You're slandering me." An Avcilla looked at him gloomily. "Guards, how are you guarding the door? Quickly take him down." But this time, Jin Sheng strangely didn't listen to him. Instead, He looked at Scylla coldly and motioned for Kim Yoon to continue. Imperial Father, let's not talk about anything else. Let's talk about the power in the palace. Who else can play you and Prince Lu Yi together in the palm of their hands? He smiled bitterly, but his eyes looked coldly at Scylla. He faintly said, if I had the ability, last night, I wouldn't have been. Speaking of this, his eyes were filled with grief and he couldn't continue. Jin Sheng remembered that his son didn't have any power in the palace. The only ones who could do this were Scylla and Jin Ju, who were highly valued by him. And the two of them had always been on good terms. Jin Ju even personally led people to break into the scene. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but gnash his teeth. He fiercely stared at Scylla. Scylla anxiously said, Your Majesty, he's speaking irresponsibly. Kim Yoon said, I didn't say it was you. Why are you so anxious? As he spoke, he looked deeply at Jin Sheng and sneered, Now, I'm already at the end of my road. I'm not afraid of anything. I only hope that Imperial Father won't be manipulated by others. Imperial Father, why didn't you think about why Scylla was so enthusiastic about Lu Yi's matter? He's afraid of offending Lu Yi's prince. I'm afraid that when the time comes, someone colluding with outsiders to rebel will be the truth. Imperial Father, take care of yourself. With that, he laughed and left. Scylla knelt on the ground again. His forehead was full of cold sweat. For the first time, he realized what it meant to kill with word. Jin Sheng had just suffered such a big blow. He was angry and suspicious at the same time. He would rather kill 100 people by mistake than let go of a single person. Compared to Kim Yoon, who posed no threat at all and could be easily crushed to death, Scylla, who had obviously been trusted by him, touched his tense nerves more. Sometimes, as long as the Emperor suspects someone, it doesn't matter whether there's evidence or not. Because all of your reasons will be used as excuses by him. And how to use people's hearts and say the most appropriate words at the most appropriate time. Words may not be unable to kill. In the cold palace, Gong Yimo was drinking wine while talking to Yoon Jin. Chapter 187. Gong Yimo did not leave for the entire night. She sat on the roof like a statue and guarded the entire night. This night was extremely difficult for Yoon Jin to endure, but it was even more so for Gong Yimo. Listening to the cries that did not stop for the entire night, she suddenly felt that she might have done something wrong. For such a person, she might be weak and useless, or she might be a crybaby. But she was also clean and pure. She was the first person who dared to tell her that she did not want to receive the Emperor's favor because he was ugly. Gong Yimo remembered a few days ago when they were chatting. She secretly said that she wanted to go to the folk music hall to dance again. She said that was when she was at her most beautiful and everyone fell for her dance steps. She really wanted to go again. Perhaps she was indeed causing trouble for Kim Yoon, but Kim Yoon was also happy to endure it. This kind of cute and fragile woman really made people unable to not protect her. The next day, when the Emperor left, he had a smile on his face. The haze between his brows was dispelled. Gong Yimo coldly watched him walk away and quickly jumped down. When she entered the door, Yoon Jin was putting on her clothes. She was shocked and tightly covered her chest like a bird startled by the twang of a bow. Gong Yimo saw the bruises on her body and her eyes were filled with anger that she could not control. Jin Sheng, that dog emperor, did he know how to treat a woman with tender feelings? Seeing that it was Gong Yimo, Yoon Jin was a little embarrassed and wanted to tidy herself up. But there was not a single part of her body that was intact. What was the point of covering up? These ambiguous marks made her feel ashamed. Seeing Gong Yimo sit over, she could not help but shrink into the bed. Don't move. Gong Yimo suddenly grabbed her. Under her palm, her body trembled slightly. She did not know if it was because of fear or because of the lingering fear from last night. Gong Yimo comforted her and then slowly pulled off the blanket in front of her chest. Together with half of her clothes, she exposed her to her eyes, delicate and fragile. Seeing that Gong Yimo was looking at her without saying anything, Yoon Jin said shyly, Your Majesty, he has already promised me. He said that he will not send Yoon to Lu Yi. There was a little pride in her voice, as if she had already forgotten how she cried miserably last night and how she was treated. Gong Yimo suppressed the complicated feelings in her heart and praised, "I knew that no one but you could do it." Her words made her face slightly redden. Yoon Jin turned her body awkwardly. "Miss, don't look. My body is a withered flower and will only dirty your eyes." Gong Yimo took out a bottle of medicine. Madam Yoon Jin's body must be the prettiest in the world. Otherwise, how could she have given birth to Kim Yoon? Her fingers were coated with the medicine. The moment she touched her skin, Yoon Jin could not help but tremble. She closed her eyes tiredly. She actually allowed Gong Yimo to do whatever she wanted. The faint fragrance of the ointment soothed her expression quite a bit. Her nerves, which had been tense since just now, also gradually relaxed. She suddenly said, "Miss, you did not leave last night, right?" Gong Yimo paused and softly said, "Millimeter, I knew it." Yoon Jin smiled. With her eyes closed, her smile looked a little miserable. She suddenly said, "Actually, there were many times last night that I could not take it and wanted to ask you for help." Gong Yimo could not help but breathe lightly. She was almost holding her breath as she listened to her. "I knew that as long as I shouted, you would definitely come to save me. You even lectured Yoon the last time. Miss, you are also a person who does not care about the consequences sometimes." Her eyes were half open. Her long eyelashes were trembling slightly, as if she was afraid. "But I endured it. Every time, I would tell myself to endure it a little more. Just a little more and everything would be fine. I did not expect that once I endured it, it would be the entire night. It was like a nightmare." Gong Yimo lowered her eyes and did not speak. She continued, "Actually, I hoped that you would rush in and save me last night. That way, I would have an excuse. It's not that I did not have the courage, it's not that I did not want to persist. It was you who interrupted my persistence. But you did not." She did not hold it in and did not rush in. That low cry made her feel guilty, but it did not make her lose her composure. "That's why I hated you for a long time last night." After Yoon Jin finished speaking, she turned around and looked at Gong Yimo with her eyes wide open. "Also, I realized that when I hate someone, time passes faster. So I hate you even more." Gong Yimo held the medicine bottle in one hand and looked at her with the other hand in the air. Her expression was actually a little pitiful. "Then why don't you hate the emperor?" Gong Yimo said indifferently. "The person who directly abused you, the person who caused all of your suffering, why don't you hate him?" Gong Yimo's question made Madam Yoon Jin open her mouth slightly, not knowing how to refute. "Because you are a coward." Gong Yimo looked at her with a flickering light in her eyes. Her tone was also very soft, as if she was not refuting her. "In your heart, the emperor is high and undefeatable. But in your heart, I'm just like you, a woman. But I'm much more free than you. Hating him makes you feel afraid because you feel that you can't possibly be his opponent. But hating me becomes much easier because in your heart, no matter how strong a woman is, she is always weak." "No," Yoon Jin's face turned pale. Being exposed so blatantly was almost unbearable. She held her head in pain and shook her head. "It was not like that. Do you still remember the wish you told me a few days ago?" Yoon Jin suddenly stopped moving. She lowered her head and did not say a word. "You said that you wanted to go to the folk music hall to dance and experience the feeling of making the world fall for your dance again. Do you still remember?" When Gong Yimo said this, she suddenly loosened the collar in front of her chest a little in annoyance. "You are right. Sometimes, when I am impulsive, I do not care about the consequences. So I am asking you now, do you still want to go? If you say yes, I will risk my life to send you out. Whether it succeeds or not, I will do what I say." Yoon Jin heard this and looked up at her. Her eyes were actually glistening with tears. "I am sorry. Everything that happened that day, just treat it as a dream." "Why?" "Because it is already too late." After saying this, Gong Yimo heard a group of people rushing over and singing from afar. "The imperial edict has arrived. This one has come to congratulate your highness." Gong Yimo hid to the side. Not long later, a group of people walked in. They saw that Yoon Jin's clothes were disheveled and quickly came over to help Yoon Jin put on her clothes. During the entire process, Yoon Jin's expression was indifferent, as if she had become a different person. The leading eunuch was full of smiles. "Your Highness Imperial Concubine Yun is so fortunate. His Majesty has not forgotten you after so many years. It can be seen that he has deep feelings for you." Yun Jin suddenly glanced at him. That eunuch quickly reacted and slapped his mouth with a smile. "Look at this servant's lousy mouth. What Imperial Concubine Yun? It is clearly Imperial Concubine Yun. Your Highness, please do not be angry." Yun Jin suddenly spoke. "You misspoke about my position." That eunuch's face paled. Who knew that a salted fish in the cold palace would make a comeback? Just as he wanted to say some flattering words, Yun Jin spoke without even looking at him. "Since you misspoke, then slap yourself." Her words caused everyone to be stunned. Who did not know that Yun Jin had a cowardly personality? But that eunuch was not a normal person. He quickly slapped himself rather viciously. The slapping sounds echoed throughout the cold palace. As he slapped himself, he said, "This servant was wrong. Begging your Highness for forgiveness." Gong Yimo watched from the shadows as Yun Jin punished the eunuch. That gaze of hers went from slight unease and fear to pleasure and then to awe. Then, with the sound of slapping, she finished changing her clothes. She glanced at the place where Gong Yimo was hiding and looked around before smiling faintly. "In the future, this one is Imperial Concubine Yun. Everything here, burn it." After saying this, she walked out with large strides. When the palace servants heard this, they quickly took out matches and lit candles. What a joke! This was the Emperor's beloved. They could not afford to offend her. In the midst of the flames, Gong Yimo watched as Yun Jin left. After the flames started burning, Yun Jin also turned around at the right time. Although they could not see each other, their gazes seemed to meet. One look, resolute. Chapter 188. In the blink of an eye, more than a year had passed. Gong Yimo was already 15 years old. At this moment, she was sitting under a pergola by the river. Looking at the progress and the busy workers, she estimated that the secret river channels would be opened up within this month. Thinking about the rolling in money after the river channels were opened up, she happily drank herbal tea and looked at the green mountains and clear waters. She was very satisfied. After more than a year of hard work, Gong Yimo became a little rich woman again. With the support of Imperial Consort Yun, Gong Yimo and Kim Yun joined forces to take over one pawnshop after another and opened a bank. In this year and a half, the emperor basically spent most of his time at Yun Jin's place. Pillow talk was also free. When a country was mobilized, it was very powerful. In addition, Kim Yun was very generous. Although the bank was still in its early stages, it earned a lot of money every day. Kim Yun finally lived a temporarily stable life. However, all of this was built on his mother's sacrifice. Therefore, he could only work hard to live up to his mother's sacrifice. However, Yun Jin was no longer the Yun Jin of the past. More than a year ago, when the eldest prince was still recuperating, he was sent to Luyi with Rucha. His pitiful mother cried her heart out. She even knelt outside Imperial Consort Yun's palace for a day and a night, begging her to be merciful. However, she knelt until she fainted in the end. She did not see Yun Jin even once. Later, the fourth prince also lost his hearing because of an ear disease due to improper treatment. Half of his ear was cut off and his face was damaged. He was considered a cripple. Because of this, his mother went to find trouble with Yun Jin more than once. In the end, one day, Yun Jin fell into the water because of her and the emperor demoted her by 3 ranks. Now, in the palace, even the empress had to avoid her. Gong Yimo was used to the disputes in the harem. Anyway, whatever she wanted to do, Kim Yun would naturally help her. Therefore, she was happy to be an advisor. In any case, as long as Kim Yun asked, Yun Jin would definitely agree. Therefore, she had not seen Yun Jin for a long time. At this time, someone sent a secret letter. It turned out that it was news from Dayu State. After becoming rich, she had been paying attention to the movements of the 4 major countries, especially the situation in Dayu State. Even she could not explain why she was constantly paying attention to these news, but she could not help but want to listen to these bits and pieces. When the Marquis Zhengguo's funeral was held, The Empress wanted to reject this marriage. However, later on, Miss Su fell into the water and the Crown Prince saved her. The Crown Prince ruined her reputation. The Crown Prince then promised in front of everyone that he would wait for Su Miaolan for 3 years. This move shocked the entire court. Everyone in the Marquis Zhonghua was grateful to Gong Che, but the Empress was so angry that she fell ill. Later on, the Empress's health improved slightly. Gong Che went to visit her once. It was unknown what he said, but the Empress fell silent. He then went to the Huai River alone. The blueprint of the Yulong Grand Canal was calculated by her, so Gong Che could not change the path of the tributaries without permission. Then, when she was done digging up the river in Yuheng, Daiyu State would be done soon. However, the trade between the two countries could not avoid Gong Che. It was very likely that they would meet. She thought about how Gong Che said that he liked her. Now, she did not know what the situation was. Of course, in Yuheng, she heard news about Gong Dai the most. He seemed to be purposely making his presence known. She did not need to deliberately ask around to hear about his deeds. For example, he saved the emperor from the jaws of a tiger on the hunting ground. He served the emperor until he fainted when he was seriously ill. He was also given a treasured sword by the emperor to purge the corrupt officials. Countless houses were confiscated. Every time there was a bloodbath at the market, it was he who presided over the court. At a young age, he made the corrupt officials tremble in fear. It was said that he personally set up Zhao Prison. There were countless punishments in there. It was horrifying. Almost none of those who entered came out alive. In summary, there was only one meaning. Gong Dai was very favored and the emperor trusted him completely. Not only did he control half of the imperial army, but he also punished the corrupt officials. In Daiyu State, he could be said to be second only to the emperor. At this time, Gong Che had not returned. When Gong Che returned to the capital one day, she did not know what kind of undercurrent would be brewing. At this time, Kim Yoon walked towards her from afar. The warm sunlight enveloped his body in a halo. His appearance was exquisite and beautiful, and the melancholy between his brows in the past had disappeared, making his entire being glow. The corners of his snow-white clothes fluttered with his large strides, giving him a kind of dazzling beauty. Gong Yimo saw that the people coming and going all bowed to him, but she did not move. She sat under the pergola and drank herbal tea, sizing him up with narrowed eyes. In the past year, Kim Yoon had made a comeback. His status had risen. He was beautiful and rich. The girls who wanted to marry him could line up from the palace to the border. Moreover, Yoon Gui Fei had held a consort selection banquet for him more than once, but he had rejected it with the reason that he did not like her. As a result, Gong Yimo narcissistically thought, could this person have taken a liking to her? At this time, Kim Yoon also approached the pergola. He looked at the people outside busily digging the canal and said half-jokingly, I heard that you have a powerful weapon in your hands that can cut through mountains and water. What, are you so scared that you don't dare to use it now? Gong Yimo poured him a cup of herbal tea and giggled. It's not that I don't need it. It's not time yet. As she spoke, she asked with Schadenfreude, why did you come out? Didn't your mother consort say that if you don't choose a consort, she won't let you out? Speaking of mother consort. He glanced at Gong Yimo. Mother consort misses you. Every time, she would ask you why you don't go into the palace to see her. Forget it. Gong Yimo shrugged. Your Yuheng Imperial Palace is too chaotic. I won't go. Today, Yuheng Imperial Palace could be said to be extremely extravagant. They imitated the ancient people in digging wine pools. All the palace servants in the wine pools could only wear light muslin. Moreover, they were all beauties. Everywhere was filled with the fragrance of wine and meat and the scent of women's cosmetics. Moreover, the music was incessant. It made people immersed in it, unable to see the light. It was said that Jin Sheng was addicted to it every day. Now, even the memorials were read by Kim Yoon. Speaking of this, Kim Yoon smiled embarrassedly. He also did not know what to say. His mother consort had changed. She was clearly the same person, but sometimes, he felt a little scared. For example, imitating Shongju's wine pool and meat forest. It was Yoon Jin's request. Only, she still cared about him. But sometimes, the way she looked at him was strange. There was a feeling that he could not describe. At this time, Gong Yimo raised her cup and faintly said, "You have to be careful of your mother consort." Kim Yoon smiled. Just as he was about to say that she was joking, Gong Yimo said another sentence. This sentence, "I'm serious." She looked outside and revealed a meaningful smile. A weak person could not suddenly become brave and strong. The only way she could become strong was to twist and finally become abnormal. "Let's not talk about this." Kim Yoon suddenly changed the topic. "I can't leave these 2 days, but I have already sent a letter to Dayu State's Crown Prince. I told him about the cooperation of the canal. He is very interested and asked me to send someone to contact one of his subordinates. That person is in charge of repairing the tributaries that we need. I hope that you can meet him in my place." Chapter 189. Kim Yoon smiled again. "This is a serious matter. Other than you, I really don't have a better candidate." Gong Yimo was a little hesitant. She was going to Dayu State, and she was going to meet Gong Che's people. Although, the people who followed Gong Che during the construction of the canal were all replaced by Gong Che, it was hard to guarantee that they wouldn't be familiar faces. If she went, even if she disguised herself, it would be a little dangerous. Seeing her hesitation, Kim Yoon looked at her and said a little forcefully, "It's settled then. This matter belongs to none other than you. You'll make the trip for me." Gong Yimo thought that it shouldn't be a big problem, so she agreed. Moreover, her people had given up because they left in a hurry, and because they were afraid of being found, they hadn't contacted each other for more than a year. This time, they could contact each other and restart the plan. After settling this matter, Kim Yoon seemed very relaxed. It was still better here. When he was in the palace, he was almost out of breath. However, Gong Yimo put down her cup and said in a low voice, "Before I go, I have a very serious question to ask you." Kim Yoon glanced at her and raised his cup to drink tea. Although he didn't need to be a singer anymore, the moment he glanced over, his eyes moved, and it was a stunning sight. Gong Yimo wasn't moved by his beauty and said seriously, "I want to ask you something. I want to ask you, is it because you like me that you refuse to get married again and again?" There was a phut sound. Fortunately, it wasn't directed at Gong Yimo. He wiped his mouth with a slightly red face and glared at her. "What nonsense are you thinking about now?" Gong Yimo looked at him with a smile, but deep in her eyes, there was a serious look. "I just want to confirm. If it's really because of me, I won't be wronged if the imperial concubine finds trouble with me in the future." Hearing this, Jin Yoon gradually withdrew his smile and looked at her deeply. "It's not because of you." Then, as if to emphasize something, he said it again. "It's not because of you." Gong Yimo nodded in satisfaction when she saw that his answer was so straightforward and his expression didn't seem to be fake. "Then I'm relieved. Hey, I won't be here for the construction. Remember to get someone else to keep an eye on it. I'll go pack up now and head to Dayu State." Seeing her so excited, Kim Yoon suddenly pulled her with some hesitation. "Are you coming back?" Gong Yimo was baffled by his question, but at the same time, she sighed. "Of course I'm back." She blinked. For the time being, there was no place for her in Dayu State. Kim Yoon heaved a sigh of relief and gradually let go of his hand. Watching her walk away step by step, Kim Yoon held his heart and sighed. He would never admit that he liked her. Because she was like an eagle in the sky. She was not someone he could have. Therefore, all he had to do was to protect them. He could tell everyone in the world that he didn't like her. As long as he knew in his heart that it was a lie, that was enough. Gong Yimo changed her clothes and darkened her face. However, she still felt that this wasn't enough. She drew thick eyebrows and even dotted a mole on the side of her face. Her entire aura changed. She looked like a strategist who had traveled extensively. This was also her experience in disguising herself over the past year. This wasn't the first time she had wandered around Dayu State, but no one had recognized her. Firstly, it was because the people at the border didn't recognize her. Secondly, her skills were superb. However, she might have to meet some acquaintances this time, so she had to be more careful. It was actually very easy to disguise herself. The real challenge was to imitate a person's temperament. For example, a scholar had to imitate his refined, weak, and somewhat noble temperament. For example, a performer had to imitate his seemingly cold, arrogant, and inferior aura. His eyes had to be full of contradictions. After a period of practice, Gong Yimo could already act as an old man without makeup. Her expression and actions made it seem as if she had been possessed by an old man. Every time Kim Yoon saw her acting, he would have a strange expression. She had a lot of fun. With her life's ups and downs, this kind of disguise was very easy for her. Therefore, this time, she hypnotized herself in her heart. She was a strategist who had traveled extensively and was meticulous. She definitely wouldn't be recognized. She set off just like that. She headed all the way south. Her destination was Dayu State. Meanwhile, in the Qi Manor in the capital, there were more than 20 people kneeling on the floor of the bedroom. They had clearly just returned from court and hadn't even taken off their official robes. Judging from their ranks, they were all important officials ranging from 1st to 4th rank. A youth was lying on the bed. Although he was a youth, his aura was far more stable and cold than an adult's. Although he was an adult, his eyes were cold and clear. At first glance, he looked like he didn't know anything about the world. If there were outsiders here, they would definitely find it strange. Just who was this youth? Why was it that when he didn't speak, the people kneeling on the floor were already so afraid? What did you say just now? The moment the clear and unique voice sounded, the temperature in the room suddenly turned cold. Even though it was clearly a hot summer day, it made the leader's teeth chatter. You said that you failed? The youth slightly raised his eyebrows. His black jade-like eyes fell on the leader, causing him to tremble and quickly kowtow. I beg your highness to give this official another chance. This time, the 4th prince was just lucky. Next time, this official will definitely not disappoint your highness. When he saw that Gong Dai didn't answer, his face turned pale with fright. His voice suddenly became louder and more hurried as he kowtowed again and again. I beg your highness to believe in this official one more time. I beg your highness to be magnanimous. Don't expose this official's crimes. This official swears with my life. Next time, I will definitely make sure that the 4th prince's position is not guaranteed. The position of the head of the Department of Cautious Punishment belongs to your highness. After he finished speaking, he led a group of people to kneel on the floor. They didn't dare to say more, afraid that they would annoy him. They fearfully waited for Gong Dai's final judgment. Gong Dai glanced at the people on the floor and smiled faintly. The royal sister once said that in a country, the most capable, the smartest, the boldest, and the most meticulous were the corrupt officials. Although the corrupt officials were hateful, if used well, they were also a sharp weapon. Therefore, he racked his brains to obtain the emperor's trust. Borrowing the emperor's imperial sword, he opened Zhao prison and became the #1 anti-corruption official. All the corrupt officials were afraid of him. Because once he found out, there were only 2 outcomes. First, he suppressed the evidence and depending on the severity of the case, he asked the corrupt official to do something for him. If it was done, the case would be closed. As long as he didn't get a hold of the evidence the next time, he could basically escape with his life. But if it was a simple matter, how could it be worth a life? The things he asked people to do were all extremely tricky things. Danger and opportunity coexisted. Second, if you didn't agree and thought that someone else would come to save you, he would definitely let the emperor issue a decree to confiscate your family. At that time, not only would you see your entire family being fired, you would also be imprisoned in Zhao prison. As for whether you could live until the day you were rescued, that would be fate. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.